3 enemy snipers on the North Ridge, and every single one of you has been staring at the wrong mountain for the past 40 minutes. The voice came from behind them, from inside the fog, from a direction that should have been empty mountain and nothing else. 12 Navy SEALs spun simultaneously, weapons up, fingers moving toward triggers, and found a woman standing 10 meters away in the gray cold, holding a precision rifle at her side, watching them the way a surgeon watches people who just discovered there's a scalpel missing. She wasn't running. She wasn't afraid. She had been there the entire time. If this story reaches you today, subscribe to our channel, follow every part until the very end, and drop a comment telling us exactly which city you're watching from. I want to see how far this goes. The first bullet hit the rocks 3 inches from Sergeant Danny Kowalski's left boot. He didn't hear the shot. He felt the impact, a sharp crack of stone splitting apart a spray of dust across his ankle, and then nothing. No sound of a rifle, no muzzle flash, just a neat hole punched into solid granite and the terrible silence that followed. Contact. Lieutenant Ethan Cole's voice broke over the team frequency before Kowalski had fully processed what happened. Down. Everybody down. 12 bodies dropped behind whatever cover existed on that frozen ridge. Some found rocks. Some found shallow depressions in the mountain face. 1 SEAL. Petty Officer Marcus Webb pressed himself flat against a 2-inch ledge and willed himself invisible. There was no second shot. That was the part that frightened Ethan most. A sniper who fires once and then waits knows something. They're not panicking. They're not burning ammunition. They fired that round with a specific purpose, and now they're watching to see what it accomplished. Ethan brought his rifle scope to his eye and swept the opposite ridge. Gray. Fog. Rock formations dissolving into mist at the 300-meter mark. Beyond that, nothing visible. The weather had closed in over the Coron Range during the previous night, dropping temperatures and visibility, simultaneously wrapping the high terrain in a thick gray blanket that muffled sound and swallowed distance. "Anyone have eyes on the shooter?" Ethan said. Silence on the line. Then Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb's voice. "Negative." "Negative," said another man. "Nothing. Can't see past 400 meters. Ethan ran the math in his head. The elevation differential between the team's position and the opposite ridge. The wind coming across the valley from the northwest gusting variable. The kind of wind that made long-range shooting a conversation between the shooter and physics. The fog layer which should have made concealment equally difficult for both sides. It hadn't. Somebody out there could see them. Somebody out there had made a shot that landed 3 inches from a SEAL's boot, with enough precision to be deliberate, close enough to signal without killing. Warning shots meant something. They meant the shooter wanted them to know they were seen without immediately making them casualties. That was either a tactical decision or a communication attempt. Either way, it required a level of discipline that Ethan respected, even as it scared him. "Webb," he said quietly, "I need you to sweep the north face, slowly. Any movement, any heat signature, anything." "Already scanning," Webb said. "Nothing. If there's someone up there, they're buried." Ethan pressed his back against the rock formation and considered his options. His team was pinned. They couldn't advance without crossing open ground that was apparently under surveillance. They couldn't extract without moving backward along the same ridge they'd come in on, which was exposed for nearly 400 meters. They couldn't call in fire support because the fog made aerial observation useless, and his intelligence package didn't include confirmed enemy positions, just a general grid reference for a command structure that was supposed to be operating somewhere in this valley. Supposed to be. The enemy commander. They were hunting a man designated only as Nighthawk. In the mission briefing had moved his operation 3 times in the past 6 weeks. Every time Coalition intelligence thought they had his location confirmed, he was already somewhere else. He had a source. Everybody in the intelligence community knew it. Nobody had been able to identify who was feeding him information, but the pattern was undeniable. He didn't move randomly. He moved in response to specific intelligence being accessed at the Coalition headquarters level. That was the reason Ethan's team had been sent in without a full operational brief. Need to know had been stripped to its absolute minimum. 6 people at the headquarters building knew this mission existed. The other 600 people working in that building did not. And somehow, an enemy sniper had still found them. The second shot came 12 minutes later. It hit the rock formation 6 inches above Webb's head, showering him with stone fragments and dropping him involuntarily to one knee before his training brought him back under control. North Ridge, Webb said, his voice absolutely steady, despite the fact that he was bleeding slightly from a cut above his eyebrow where a fragment had caught him. I got a bearing on the sound. Approximately 2,000 meters, give or take. 2,000 meters. Ethan processed that number. 2,000 meters through fog and variable wind hitting within 6 inches of a target. That wasn't a random shot. That was a statement. That was someone demonstrating not just that they could see the team, but that they had chosen not to kill anyone. Not yet. Options, Ethan said. We can try to flank left, said Petty Officer Second Class Jordan Price, the team's youngest operator. Use the ravine system. Come around the northern face from the east. If they can see through this fog at 2,000 meters, they can definitely see us moving through the ravine, Webb said. Our position is exposed, said Sergeant First Class Derek Holt, the team's communications specialist. If they wanted to kill us, we'd already be dead. There's something else happening here. Ethan had been thinking the same thing. He just hadn't wanted to say it first, because once you acknowledged that the enemy was choosing not to kill you, the question of why became the most urgent tactical problem you'd ever faced. Holt's right, Ethan said. These aren't kill shots. They're markers. Someone is showing us something. Or testing us, Webb said. Testing what? Nobody answered. Then the third shot came. It didn't hit near anyone. It hit a rock, 40 meters to their right, a large boulder that none of them had been using for cover, isolated, distinctive in shape. And when the dust from the impact cleared, Ethan realized that the angle was different. The incoming trajectory had shifted. Slightly. But enough. He grabbed his scope, swept the new bearing. Still nothing. Still fog and gray rock and the shapes of mountain formations dissolving into mist. But the trajectory shift meant the shooter had either moved position or there was a second shooter. A second shooter at 2,000 meters coordinating with the first. What in the hell is out there? Jordan muttered under his breath. Nobody answered him either. Ethan made the decision that every team leader dreads making in the field. He decided to move. Not retreat. Not advance. Move laterally toward the eastern ravine system. Webb had mentioned using what limited cover the terrain provided. If they stayed static, they would eventually exhaust their options. Movement at least gave them information. It told them whether the shooter would track them, adjust fire, or hold position. We move in 30 seconds, Ethan said. Webb takes point. I'm at the rear. Nobody breaks cover until I say go. And the moment we're moving, I want every set of eyes scanning north. If anyone sees anything, smoke, movement, light, reflection, anything, call it immediately. Understood. 12 voices said in various forms of agreement. They moved. The first 30 meters were the worst. Open ground, shallow angle. Nothing between them and the invisible enemy beyond the fog. Ethan moved at the rear of the formation and felt the exposure across every inch of his back. The cold air that had stopped feeling cold 3 hours ago suddenly felt very cold again. His hands were steady because he had trained them to be steady. His heartbeat was elevated because he was human. Nobody shot. They reached the ravine entrance, dropped into the shadow of the eastern rock wall, and Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't fully realized he'd been holding. Status, he said. All present. Webb confirmed. Nobody hit. We're in. Ethan looked north. Still nothing visible. The fog sat over the ridge system like a living thing, breathing, shifting, swallowing shapes and distances. Then someone spoke from behind him. Not on the radio. Not from within his team. From behind him in the ravine, from a direction that should have been empty mountain. A woman's voice. Calm. Controlled. The kind of voice that had obviously decided a long time ago that showing emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. You moved the right way. Most teams don't. They usually try to push north and get cut down in the approach. Every weapon in the formation came up simultaneously. 12 rifles pointing into the fog at a shadow that materialized slowly, deliberately, with obvious awareness of exactly how dangerous the moment was. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't surrendering. She was walking forward the way someone walks forward when they've already calculated every possible outcome and decided they're comfortable with all of them. She stopped at 10 meters. Her rifle, a precision long-range system that Ethan immediately recognized as something outside standard issue, something custom configured for extreme distances, was slung muzzle down across her back. Her hands were visible, empty. Her face, when the fog shifted slightly, was young. Younger than her eyes suggested. "Who are you?" Ethan said. His voice was flat because he was making it flat. Inside his mind was running through every possible explanation for how a woman operating alone had appeared behind a 12-man SEAL team in a mountain ravine that should have been clear. "Captain Olivia Hayes," she said. "Army Special Reconnaissance. I've been embedded in this mountain system for 4 days." "Embedded with who?" Webb said. "Nobody," she said. "That's what embedded means in my operational context. Solo reconnaissance and surveillance. I was assigned to monitor the Corin Valley complex 6 days ago. I've been on station since day 4. "Who assigned you?" "CENTCOM J2 through a separate channel. My mission doesn't cross-reference with your mission because my mission doesn't exist in the same documents as your mission." Ethan lowered his rifle by 3 degrees. He didn't holster it. He didn't take his finger off the trigger guard. But he lowered the barrel, which was a signal, and she understood it. "Those shots," he said. "That was you." "Yes." "Why?" "Because you were about to move toward the North Ridge, and the North Ridge has 3 enemy snipers in elevated positions. The first shot was directional. I wanted you to stop. The second was a range demonstration. The third was a coordinate marker pointing you toward the ravine." Ethan stared at her. "You were communicating through bullet impacts," he said. "I was communicating through the only language I had available to me," she said. "I couldn't reach you on any radio frequency because your communications are encrypted to a standard I don't have the keys for. I couldn't approach your position on foot without risking being identified as a threat before I could explain myself. So I used the tools available to me." Jordan Price, standing 3 positions to Ethan's left, said something that the rest of the team was probably thinking. "She shot 3 times at ranges above 2,000 meters in this fog and put every round within 6 inches of the intended point of impact." Nobody responded to that, because there was nothing useful to say about it. The numbers were either true or they weren't. If they were true, the implications were significant. If they weren't true, the woman in front of them was lying about something that could be immediately verified by reviewing where the impacts had actually occurred. Ethan made a decision. He made it the way he made all his decisions in the field, quickly, with incomplete information, accepting that the risk of inaction sometimes exceeded the risk of trust. "Tell me about the 3 snipers," he said. Olivia unslung the rifle from her back in one smooth motion and brought the scope to her eye. She didn't point it at any of the SEALs. She angled it north toward the ridge system across the valley, and for several seconds, she simply looked. "The first position is behind a rock formation approximately 60 meters south of the ridge crest. 2 meters wide natural cover. He's been in that position for approximately 9 hours, which means he's disciplined, but starting to feel the cold. Cold snipers rush their breathing. He'll be slightly less accurate on the next engagement than he was when he fired at your team initially." Ethan glanced at Webb, who had his own optics trained north. Webb shook his head slightly. He couldn't see anything through the fog. "Second position," Olivia continued, "is mobile. I've tracked this shooter moving between 3 locations over the past 18 hours. He follows a pattern approximately 40-minute intervals, which suggests he's rotating to prevent targeting by counter-sniper assets. Smart, but the pattern itself is information. He'll be at the easternmost position in approximately 11 minutes. "And the third," Ethan said. Olivia lowered the scope, looked at Ethan directly. "The third is the one you need to worry about. He's not positioned where snipers typically position themselves. He's forward much farther down the ridge than he should be. He's taken an elevated risk to get closer, which either means he's extraordinarily confident, or he's been told something specific about your team's approach route. specifically that you'd be using the Northern Ravine system. The silence that followed was not a comfortable silence. I was told we'd use the Northern Ravine, Ethan said slowly. It's one of 3 natural approaches to the compound, Olivia said. It's also the one a SEAL team would most likely select based on standard infiltration doctrine. Someone who knows SEAL doctrine knew to position an asset there. You're suggesting an intelligence breach. I'm suggesting someone with access to special operations tactical doctrine provided the enemy with probable approach vectors. Ethan looked at Webb again. This time Webb met his eyes directly, and the communication that passed between them in that look was something that existed only between people who had spent years working in environments where the wrong kind of intelligence, reaching the wrong hands, was the difference between coming home and not coming home. You said you've been here 4 days, Ethan said to Olivia. What else have you seen? More than your mission brief accounted for, she said. The compound your team is targeting isn't a command post, it's a relay station. Nighthawk isn't here. He moved 3 days ago. But whoever told him you were coming left a trace, and that trace tells me that the intelligence compromise you're dealing with isn't random. It's specifically targeted at Special Operations mission planning. Ethan's jaw tightened. How specific, he said. Specific enough that there are 3 snipers on that ridge, instead of the 2 that standard defensive doctrine would place. Someone gave them an extra asset. Someone who knew your team size. 12 men, 3 snipers. The math was deliberate. I need to know everything you've seen, Ethan said. Every patrol movement, every position shift, every communication signal you've observed. Olivia looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite skepticism and not quite calculation. It was the look of someone deciding how much trust to extend based on evidence that was still incomplete. I'll tell you everything, she said. But first, we need to deal with the 3 snipers. Because in approximately 8 minutes, the mobile shooter reaches his eastern position, and from there he has a clear line of sight to this ravine entrance. If he gets there before we've neutralized him, this conversation becomes academic. Can you take all 3? Ethan said. He asked it the way you ask a mechanic if they can fix something, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a genuine operational question. Olivia answered it the same way. Not simultaneously, in sequence. The static shooter first, he's the most predictable and represents the highest sustained risk to your team. The mobile shooter second, but only during the window when he's transitioning between positions. He's exposed for approximately 90 seconds during each transition, and the forward shooter third, but that one requires repositioning on my part. I'll need to move to a different elevation. How long for all 3? Ethan said. 40 minutes if nothing goes wrong. And if something goes wrong? Olivia looked at him with those older-than-they-should-be eyes. Then we adapt, she said. Webb moved to Ethan's side and lowered his voice to the level that meant he was speaking to his commander, rather than contributing to a general discussion. Sir, if she is who she says she is, and the intelligence compromise is real, we need to reconsider our entire approach to this operation. I know, Ethan said. We also might want to reconsider who we report this back to until we know where the breach is. I know that too, Ethan said. He looked at Olivia. Captain Hayes, the intelligence compromise you're describing, do you have evidence? I have 4 days of observational data indicating a defensive preparation that significantly exceeds what standard intelligence would have produced. The enemy knew your team was coming. They didn't know exactly when, but they knew it was coming. And they prepared specifically for a SEAL-sized element. That's circumstantial, Ethan said. Everything is circumstantial until it isn't, Olivia said. But I've been in this mountain range for 4 days. I've watched their defensive preparations evolve in real time, and I can tell you with confidence that what I'm looking at is not a coincidence. It's a response to information. She paused. Now, do you want to have a conversation about evidence standards? Or do you want me to deal with the 3 people on that ridge who are currently trying to figure out where your team went? Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then, take the first shot whenever you're ready. Olivia moved. She didn't ask for a position recommendation. She didn't request assistance or covering fire or a spotter. She simply moved to the eastern face of the ravine, found an angle that apparently satisfied some calculation. She was running entirely in her own head, and brought the rifle up. She lay prone on cold stone. No adjustment period. No settling in. She was immediately still in the way that certain people become. Still, not the stillness of inaction, but the stillness of absolute focus. Every unnecessary function of a human body, suspended in service of the one necessary function. The SEALs spread out instinctively, covering the approaches, weapons oriented outward, giving her the space and the silence she needed without being told to do it. They were professionals reading a situation and responding to it. What she was doing required quiet. 40 seconds passed. Then Olivia fired. The shot was single, unhurried, and definitive. Through his scope, Webb saw the rock formation on the opposite ridge, the specific position Olivia had described, and he saw the movement behind it cease. A shape that had been partially visible, a dark outline against gray stone, collapsed and did not move again. First target down. Webb reported, then immediately checked himself because she hadn't needed him to tell her that. She already knew. She was already moving. Not running. Moving. The precise, controlled displacement of someone who understood that staying in a firing position after a shot was how snipers became targets themselves. She shifted 12 meters east along the ravine floor, found a new angle, went still again. 8 minutes passed. Ethan watched the clock on his wrist and felt each minute in his chest. 7 minutes until the mobile shooter reached his eastern position. 7 minutes until that angle to the ravine entrance opened up. Jordan said quietly. She said 11 minutes until the transition. I know, Ethan said. We're at 8. I know, Jordan. She's cutting it close. She knows that too. Olivia fired the second shot at 9 minutes and 40 seconds. The mobile shooter had begun his transition. 90 seconds of exposure. She used 43 of them. The shot was longer than the first. Webb estimated it at over 2,200 meters, and the fog had thickened slightly in the past 10 minutes, the valley between the ridges filling with gray air that shifted and breathed. She hit. Webb saw the confirmation through his scope. The transitioning shape that had been moving stopped moving. Second target, he reported. Olivia was already repositioning again. The third shot was the one that took 40 minutes. She moved twice more, finding angles, calculating, apparently working through a geometry of terrain and elevation and wind that existed entirely in her head. The SEALs maintained their formation, maintained their coverage, and waited. Jordan stopped counting minutes out loud after the second shot. There was nothing useful to say. When the third shot came, it came from a position that none of them had seen her reach, a ledge above the ravine floor, accessible apparently by a route that was either not obvious or required the specific physical ability and risk tolerance of someone who had been operating alone in mountains for 4 days and had already internalized the terrain completely. The sound of the shot was different at the new elevation. Sharper. Quicker to dissipate into the mountain air. Webb scanned the forward position Olivia had described. The closer one. The deliberate one, placed in violation of standard doctrine, specifically because someone had told the enemy which direction the team would be approaching from. The shape in that position did not move again. Olivia came down from the ledge. She walked back into the ravine floor as though she had simply stepped away to think. 3 targets, she said. North Ridge is clear. Ethan stared at her. He had been commanding special operations personnel for 11 years. He had worked alongside people who represented the absolute edge of human capability in every category of warfare the modern world had constructed categories for. He was not easily impressed. He had built that characteristic deliberately because being impressed in the field was a distraction, and distractions cost lives. But he stared at her. Because what she had just done, the sequence of shots, the calculations, the movement, the timing, was not something he could place inside the framework of performance that his 11 years had given him. It was something else. It was something that existed at the edge of what he had believed was possible. Captain Hayes, he said. Sir, she said, not sarcastically, just as a response to address. I need everything you have, Ethan said. Every piece of intelligence you've gathered in 4 days, every movement pattern, every communication you've intercepted, Every detail about this compound and the people defending it. Because if Nighthawk isn't here, and there's a breach in my mission intelligence, the entire operation needs to be reframed, right now, before we move another meter toward that compound. Olivia reached into her pack and removed a small notebook. Not digital. Paper. Handwritten in a shorthand that was partially personal code and partially standard military notation. Everything's in here, she said. But I need to walk you through it because some of it requires context that doesn't exist on the page. Then walk me through it, Ethan said. She opened the notebook, and what Ethan heard in the next 20 minutes changed his understanding of not just this mission, but of the war. They were all fighting the intelligence that was supposed to guide that war, and the uncomfortable reality that the most dangerous battlefield in any conflict was not the one covered in fog and rock and sniper fire. It was the one where the information itself had been turned against the people who needed it most. The compound below them held something more dangerous than Nighthawk. It held the answer to who had told the enemy they were coming. Ethan Cole had spent 11 years learning how to read people under pressure. Not in the comfortable way. Not in the way of a psychologist sitting across a desk with a notepad and a warm cup of coffee. He had learned to read people the way field operators learned everything in moments where being wrong was fatal. He had watched men break under circumstances that looked manageable from the outside. He had watched other men hold together under circumstances that should have destroyed them. He had developed a sense not perfect, not infallible, but sharpened by 11 years of high-stakes friction for the difference between someone performing confidence and someone who had actually earned it. Olivia Hayes was not performing anything. That was what made him trust her enough to keep listening. She stood in the ravine with her notebook open and walked him through 4 days of intelligence the way a surgeon walks through an operation they've already performed in their head 100 times before making the first incision. No hesitation. No searching for words. No glancing at her notes for confirmation of things she wasn't sure about. The notebook was a record, not a crutch. Everything she told him existed first in her memory and second on those pages. Day 1, she said. Standard defensive posture. 8 fighters visible across the compound perimeter. Patrol rotation every 4 hours. Nothing unusual. Nothing that told me the target had moved. When did that change? Ethan said. Day 2, 1400 hours. 3 additional fighters arrived from the eastern approach. Not patrol, these were escorts. They brought equipment. Specifically communications equipment that doesn't match the profile of a relay station. Relay stations don't need encrypted long-range uplinks. Command posts do. Webb leaned in slightly. You're saying the compound upgraded its communications capability after your mission began. I'm saying the compound upgraded its communications capability 48 hours after my mission parameters were filed through CENTCOM J2, Olivia said. I'm also saying that the timing of that upgrade correlates more closely with the filing of my mission than with any observable change in the local threat environment. The implication landed in the ravine like something physical. Jordan Price said, "Someone at CENTCOM knew you were coming here. Someone at CENTCOM knew both of us were coming here," Olivia said. She looked at Ethan. Your mission was filed separately from mine. Different channels, different classification levels, different need-to-know lists. The only thing our missions have in common is the geographic target area. She paused. And whoever read both of them. Ethan felt the cold in the mountain air differently now. It wasn't the cold of weather. It was the cold of understanding something that changed the shape of a situation you thought you already understood. How many people had access to both mission files, he said. That's above my pay grade to answer definitively, Olivia said. But I can tell you what I've observed here, and what I've observed here suggests that the person with access didn't just pass information. They passed specific operational level detail. The kind of detail that comes from actually reading the mission parameters, not just knowing a mission exists. What kind of specific detail? Ethan said. Olivia turned a page in her notebook. Day 3. The 3 snipers arrived. They positioned themselves in a pattern that directly countered the most probable SEAL infiltration approach for this terrain. North ridge elevation, distributed coverage forward placement on the approach vector, most consistent with doctrine for a 12-man element. She looked up. Someone told them your team size, 12 men. And someone told them your probable approach. The word 12 sat in the air between them. Webb said it first quietly. Nobody outside the 6 cleared personnel knew we were 12. 7. Ethan corrected. He said it automatically without thinking, and then stopped. Webb looked at him. 7, Webb said. The number was briefed to 7 people, Ethan said. I was told 6. There were 6 names on the access log when I reviewed it. He paused. I reviewed it once 48 hours before deployment. If a 7th name was added after that review, it wouldn't appear on the version you saw, Olivia finished. Ethan went completely still. Not the stillness of a sniper preparing a shot, the stillness of a man whose mind had just accelerated beyond the capacity of his body to follow it. 7 people knew. 6 names on a log. 1 name added after the review. Someone had manipulated the access documentation. Someone with the administrative authority to modify intelligence access records after the fact. That was not a low-level breach. That was not a disgruntled analyst selling information for money. That was something that required position clearance, institutional knowledge, and deliberate intent. That was the architecture of a not improvised, not opportunistic, but constructed over time, with the specific purpose of remaining invisible, while information flowed out through a gap that nobody would think to look for. Say it out loud, Webb said, looking at Ethan, not pushing, asking, because sometimes a commander needed to hear the words spoken in order to commit to acting on them. We have a mole in the mission planning apparatus at the headquarters level, Ethan said. Senior enough to modify access logs, with visibility across multiple operational channels simultaneously. Yes, Olivia said. And that person knows we're in this mountain range right now. Yes, which means they know we're alive, which means they know the 3 snipers failed, which means they'll make another move, Olivia said. Yes, and they'll do it before we can get back to a communications environment where we can report what we've found. Jordan said very quietly, How long do we have? That depends on how long it takes them to realize the snipers are gone and reach whoever they report to, Olivia said. Based on the communication patterns I've observed, the compound makes contact with its command structure every 6 hours. Last contact was approximately 3 hours ago. 3 hours until they report, Ethan said. 3 hours until they report that the defensive screen failed and the infiltrating team is still active, Olivia said. After that, the person on the inside has to decide whether to act directly or wait. Acting directly means sending something after us. Waiting means hoping we don't find enough to bring back. What would you do? Ethan said. Olivia looked at him steadily. I wouldn't wait, she said. Waiting is for people who think they have margin. This person is out of margin. They know I've been in this mountain for 4 days. Even if they don't know exactly what I've observed, they know I've been watching. And a sniper who's been watching for 4 days in a compromised situation is the most dangerous possible loose end. The words hung in the cold air. Loose end. Ethan looked at his team. The faces of men who had operated in situations like this before, uncertain, compressed the kind of tactical environment where the rules of engagement were clear, but the rules of reality were not. They were watching him. Not for reassurance, for direction. There was a significant difference, and he had learned early in his career that confusing the two was how leaders lost their teams. We don't abort, he said. Nobody argued. Nobody nodded enthusiastically either. They absorbed the decision way. Professionals absorb decisions that carry weight with their eyes open and their hands ready. The compound is the objective, Ethan continued. Not because Nighthawk is there, he isn't. But because the communications equipment that was brought in is there, and if Olivia is right about what that equipment represents, there's documentation inside that compound that tells us who's been talking to whom and when. That's the mission now, not the original target, the actual target. Webb said, rules of engagement. Same as filed, Ethan said. We're not changing the legal framework. We're changing what we're looking for when we get inside. He looked at Olivia. I need you on Overwatch the entire approach. If there are additional defensive assets beyond the 3 you've already neutralized, I need to know before my team walks into them. Understood, she said. "Can you maintain overwatch and keep pace with our movement?" Olivia's expression shifted. Not quite amusement, not quite offense. Something that existed in the narrow space between the two. "I've been moving through this terrain for 4 days without your team's support, and without the enemy knowing exactly where I was," she said. "I can keep pace." Ethan accepted that without further comment. What happened next was the first coordinated action between his team and Olivia Hayes, and it established something that Ethan would spend the following months thinking about during the quiet hours when operational experience had time to become operational knowledge. The most effective partnerships in the field rarely begin with formal agreements. They begin with a shared understanding of what the situation requires, a mutual recognition of what each party brings to it, and the practical intelligence to let that alignment happen without ego getting in the way. Olivia moved into an overwatch position while the team began its approach toward the compound. She said one thing before she moved: "The eastern approach is cleaner than the northern. More cover at the 300-meter mark, and the sight lines from the compound's observation post don't fully cover the dead ground behind the second ridge fold. I'd take your team through that." "You already scouted the approach," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "I scouted every approach," she said, "in case I needed to extract quickly." He nodded once. She moved. The team shifted to the eastern route. They covered the first 400 meters without incident. Then Webb said very quietly on the team channel, "We have movement, compound perimeter, 2 fighters. They're not patrolling, they're searching." Ethan processed this. Searching, not patrolling, meant they knew something had changed. The snipers going silent had registered faster than Olivia had estimated. Either the compound had a check-in protocol shorter than 6 hours, or someone had been monitoring the snipers directly and noticed the gap in their activity. "Hold," Ethan said. The team went to ground. Olivia's voice came across the frequency she'd been given access to 30 minutes earlier. "I have the 2 fighters in my scope. They're moving toward the eastern approach. They may have thermal imaging." Thermal imaging changed the arithmetic significantly. "Can you tell from their body language whether they have confirmed contact or suspected contact?" Ethan said. A pause. "Suspected," Olivia said. "They're moving with caution, but not urgency. If they had thermal confirmation of your position, they'd be moving faster, and they'd have called for support. They're still in the search phase." "Can you hold them at their current position without engaging?" Ethan said. "I don't want shots fired that tell the compound exactly where their perimeter defense failed." Another pause. This one longer. "Give me 90 seconds, Olivia said. Ethan didn't ask how. He waited. 80 seconds later, both fighters stopped moving. They didn't stop because they found something. They stopped because the ground approximately 30 meters in front of them, ground that they would have had to cross to continue the search pattern, produced a sound. A specific sound. The sound of a displaced rock, the unmistakable acoustic signature of something or someone moving at a distance that was further north than where the SEAL team actually was. "They're turning," Webb said. They were. Both fighters pivoted north and began moving in the direction of the false sound, which meant moving away from the actual SEAL team position, which meant the eastern approach was open again. "What did she do?" Jordan said. "I have no idea," Webb said. "She threw a rock," said Holt, who was the team's quietest operator and who had spent the previous 10 minutes in focused observation. "From approximately 200 meters. She found a gap in their sight lines and threw a rock far enough that it registered as movement at distance. The team absorbed this." "She threw a rock 200 meters, Jordan said. "Field improvisation," Holt said. "Old technique. Works better when the targets are already nervous." "Let's move while we have the window," Ethan said. They moved. The next 150 meters went cleanly. Then the third mini-crisis hit. An additional fighter emerged from the compound's secondary entrance. Not one Olivia had noted in her 4-day surveillance record, which meant either the compound's manning had increased in the past 12 hours, or this individual had been inside and was now coming out for the first time. "New contact," Olivia said immediately. "I don't have a position history for this one. He wasn't visible in my observation window." "Armed," Ethan said. "Yes. But he's moving toward the communication structure, not the perimeter. He's not a response. He's a task. What task? A pause. He's carrying something, Olivia said. Give me a moment. The team held in place. Ethan watched the seconds compress. It's a portable drive, Olivia said. He's connecting it to the external communications terminal. Ethan, someone just told them to pull the data. The cold understanding that hit Ethan at that moment was not about the fighter or the drive or the terminal. It was about what pulling data meant. Pulling data before a situation developed further meant someone with authority had already decided the situation was beyond recovery. It meant someone who could see what was happening here, who had visibility into the operation from the inside, had made the decision to extract whatever intelligence the compound held before it could be seized. Someone was watching this operation right now, in real time, and they were ordering a data extraction. How long does a transfer like that take? Ethan said. Depends on the volume, Olivia said. A full communications archive, 15 to 20 minutes. Selective extraction of specific files, 3 to 5. He's doing selective extraction, Ethan said. Not a question. Because a full archive would require the person on the inside to have planned for this contingency in advance, and a contingency plan that specific would mean they had already anticipated being exposed, and nobody who anticipated being exposed would stay in position long enough to be this useful. Probably, Olivia said. Then we have 3 to 5 minutes before whatever documentation links the compound's communications to the mole is gone. Ethan made the fastest command decision of his career. We go now, full speed. I need that communications terminal intact and that drive still in the machine. Olivia, anyone who moves to stop us, you have weapons free. Do not let anyone near that terminal. Understood, she said, instantly. No hesitation. The team moved. Not tactically cautious movement. Rapid movement. The kind that accepted elevated risk in exchange for compressed timeline. Every member of the team understood what had just been communicated and what it required of them, and they moved like 12 people who had trained for exactly this kind of compressed high-stakes transition from deliberate to dynamic. The fighter at the terminal heard them at the 200-meter mark. He looked up. He reached for the drive. Olivia's shot took the terminal's external antenna off at the base before he could complete the disconnection sequence, which was not what Ethan had expected, but accomplished something more important than stopping the physical extraction. It severed the transfer mid-process. Whatever data had been sent in the first 90 seconds of the transfer was gone. Whatever remained in the drive was still there, and it was still connected, and a partial transfer to an outside system with a severed transmission was an incomplete record that cut both ways. The fighter froze. 20 seconds later, the SEAL team reached the terminal. The drive was still in the machine. Webb pulled it and secured it in a hardened case from his pack in approximately 4 seconds. Got it, he said. Status, Ethan said. Compound is reacting, Olivia said from Overwatch. I count 6 fighters moving toward your position. They're organized but not panicking. Someone is giving them directions. Directions coming from inside the compound or outside it, Ethan said. A pause. Outside it, Olivia said. The radio traffic is incoming. Someone is calling instructions to them from a remote position. From where? I can't get a direction on the signal without better equipment, but the timing is immediate. They started receiving instructions within seconds of you making your final approach. Ethan, whoever is on the other end of that radio, was watching for your team's movement. They weren't just pulling data. They were monitoring the approach in real time, and they called in the defensive response. Ethan looked at Webb. Webb said, They have eyes on us from somewhere other than the compound. Thermal drone, Holt said. Has to be. Nothing else explains the response time. Thermal drone, which meant there was a technical asset operating over this mountain range that wasn't on any coalition inventory that Ethan's team had been briefed about. Which meant either someone had deployed a covert asset without going through standard channels, or someone on the inside had access to assets that operated outside the standard tracking systems. Both possibilities pointed in the same direction. We need to move faster than the drone can direct a response, Ethan said. What's our best extraction route? Western descent, Olivia said. The ridge fold creates a thermal shadow at approximately 150 meters down the western face. If you can reach that shadow, the drone loses you. And then we deal with the 6 fighters before they cut off the descent route. Can you? Already repositioning, she said. 3 minutes later, the team was moving west. The compound behind them was responding fighters moving radio traffic crackling through equipment that Holt was monitoring on a separate frequency. The drone, whatever it was, wherever it had come from, was somewhere above the fog layer in visible tracking. The first of the 6 fighters appeared on the western slope. He was fast-moving with purpose, cutting off what should have been the team's primary descent angle. Olivia took him at long range through the fog with a shot that arrived before the fighter had any indication she existed. The remaining 5 fighters heard the shot and changed their pattern. Smart. They spread out, made themselves harder to target. Simultaneously tried to create a situation where engaging one meant losing track of the others. Ethan had seen this tactic before. It was designed to force a choice. "Hold your positions," he told his team. "She's got this." It was the kind of statement that required genuine confidence in the person being trusted, not the performed confidence of a commander managing morale. Ethan had watched Olivia Hayes neutralize 3 snipers at ranges above 2,000 meters through fog and wind in less than 40 minutes. He had watched her redirect a 2-person enemy search pattern with a thrown rock. He had watched her make a ballistic decision about severing a data transfer that had worked exactly as she'd intended. He had genuine confidence. She took the second fighter. The remaining 4 hesitated, that specific quality of hesitation that sets in when multiple people who were coordinating suddenly lose the certainty that coordination provides. They had been moving with the assurance that there was a tactical logic to their pattern. Now they weren't sure the pattern was safe, and unsure fighters make choices that certain fighters would never make. 2 of them went to ground. 2 kept moving, but moving cautiously, which meant moving slowly, which meant the window they were supposed to close stayed open. Ethan moved his team through it. "South," Olivia said. 10 meters south of your current bearing, and you're in the thermal shadow." They shifted. The fog thickened around them as they descended, the cold intensifying, the ground becoming less stable underfoot. Ethan moved at the rear again, weapon up, watching the slope above them for shapes that didn't belong. Nothing came. The drone, wherever it was, had lost them. "You're clear," Olivia said. "Thermal shadow is holding. Keep your descent angle, and you'll reach the secondary extraction coordinates in approximately 40 minutes. "And you," Ethan said. A pause. "I'll be there," she said. "Not I'll try, not I'll do my best, just I'll be there," stated with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone for whom the question of whether they could do something had been answered so many times in the affirmative that it no longer felt like a meaningful question. But it was 40 minutes through terrain that 4 enemy fighters were still moving through with a drone somewhere above the fog layer that might recover their position, and a mole at the headquarters level, who knew this mountain range and knew this operation, and had just proven they were willing to act in real time to protect themselves. Ethan descended into the thermal shadow and kept moving, and tried not to think about the fact that the person they trusted to watch their back from above was now moving through the same mountain range alone, and that the greatest threat she faced was not the 4 fighters who were still out there, but the one person at a desk in a building who had been watching this entire operation and knew exactly what she had seen. 40 minutes. He had to trust 40 minutes. He kept moving. Behind him, somewhere in the fog and the cold of the Corin Range. Olivia Hayes moved through. She knew better than the people hunting her, carrying a rifle, and 4 days of intelligence that could unravel the most carefully constructed intelligence compromise anyone on this operation had ever encountered. She moved alone. She always had. And the fog, which had been the enemy's advantage at the start of this day, was now entirely hers. She arrived at the extraction coordinates with 4 minutes to spare. Ethan heard her before he saw her. The soft displacement of gravel that his ear had learned to distinguish from wind over the past 2 hours of descent. The particular quality of movement that belonged to someone who understood that sound was information and treated every footstep as a decision. She came out of the fog the same way she had appeared in the ravine, with the same unhurried certainty, as though the 40 minutes of moving alone through terrain that 4 armed fighters were still occupying had been a mild inconvenience rather than a situation that would have stopped most people cold. She was bleeding from her left forearm. Not badly. A graze the kind that looks dramatic and feels sharp and means essentially nothing in operational terms. But Ethan noticed it, and he noticed that she hadn't mentioned it, and he noticed the way she moved her arm slightly differently than she had earlier, compensating without acknowledging the compensation. "Contact," he said. "One," she said. "Western slope. He found my position by sound, not by sight. I moved before he could get a clean angle. He didn't." "You're hit." "I'm grazed," she said with the particular precision of someone who had learned that imprecise language about injuries created unnecessary concern that consumed operational bandwidth. "It won't affect function." Webb was already moving toward her with a field dressing. She accepted it without protest, which told Ethan more about her judgment than any amount of demonstrated competence. People who refused medical attention in the field were either performing toughness or genuinely didn't understand the difference between acceptable risk and unnecessary risk. Olivia Hayes was not performing anything. "Thank you," she said to Webb, tying off the dressing with her right hand and her teeth in approximately 12 seconds. Webb looked at Ethan with an expression that was not quite admiration and not quite assessment. Something between the two. "We have a problem," Ethan said. "Beyond the obvious problems." Olivia looked at him. "Holt has been monitoring the radio traffic since we hit the thermal shadow," Ethan said. "The frequency the compound was using for incoming instructions, the one you identified as external, went silent approximately 20 minutes ago." "They switched frequencies," Olivia said immediately. "Or they stopped transmitting entirely," Ethan said. "Which means either the mole decided the risk of continued communication outweighed the benefit, or they accomplished whatever they were trying to accomplish." "The data extraction." "Partial data extraction," Ethan said. "Whatever transferred in the first 90 seconds before you severed the uplink. We have the drive, but we don't know what was sent before we got there." Olivia was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant she was working through something, not that she had nothing to say. "The files most likely to be pulled first in a selective extraction are the most recent ones," she said. "That's how the retrieval protocol works. Most recent activity surfaces first in any standard communications archive. If the extraction was selective, and it ran for approximately 90 seconds before I cut the uplink. The newest files went out," Ethan said. "The newest files went out," she confirmed. "Which means whoever received them knows who the compound has been in contact with most recently. But the older files, the ones that would show the history of the intelligence compromise, the original communications, establishing the relationship between the mole and the enemy command structure, those are still on the drive." "If we're lucky," Webb said. "If we're lucky," Olivia agreed. "And if the archive wasn't organized in a way that put the historically significant material at the front of the retrieval queue." Holt spoke from his position 3 meters away, where he had been monitoring his equipment throughout the conversation. "Sir, traffic on a new frequency. Not the compound, this is coming from a different direction. East-northeast." Ethan moved to him. "What kind of traffic?" "Encrypted. Standard coalition format." Holt paused. "It's one of ours." The word landed differently than it should have. One of ours. Which meant what exactly in a situation where the evidence suggested that one of ours was the source of the problem? "Can you identify the originating unit?" Ethan said. "Working on it," Holt said. "The encryption signature is CENTCOM level, but that covers a lot of people and a lot of equipment. I need more time." "How much time?" 20 minutes minimum, maybe 30. Ethan looked at the surrounding terrain. The thermal shadow that had hidden them from the drone would not protect them indefinitely. The 4 fighters who had been on the western slope were still out there. And somewhere in the east-northeast, a CENTCOM-level communications asset was transmitting on a frequency they hadn't been briefed about. "Can you tell if the transmission is directional?" Olivia said. She had moved to Holt's position without Ethan noticing, which he registered as a minor, and telling detail about her operational habits. Holt looked at her, then at his equipment, then back at her. "If I had a second receiver at a different position, I could triangulate." "Where would the second receiver need to be?" 200 meters east, ideally. 300 would be better." "What frequency range?" Holt gave her the specifics. She listened once, nodded, and held out her hand. Holt looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Olivia. "You're not going back out there alone," he said. "I went out there alone for 4 days before you arrived," she said. "I know where the remaining fighters are. I avoided them coming down here. I can avoid them going back up." She paused. "And you need a direction on that transmission before you decide your next move. Without a direction, you're making decisions without a critical piece of information. You've been doing that since before you arrived in this mountain range. It's time to stop." The directness of it landed without softening, which was what made it effective. She wasn't trying to convince him. She was laying out a logical structure and letting him follow it to the conclusion that the structure required. He handed her the secondary receiver from Holt's pack. 12 minutes, he said. "If you're not back in 12 minutes, 14, she said. "The approach angle I need adds 2 minutes. 12, he said. Not because he was certain 12 was better than 14, because it was the number he could live with. She almost smiled. It was the first time anything close to a smile had crossed her face since she'd stepped out of the fog in the ravine, and it passed so quickly that Jordan, who was watching, wasn't certain it had happened at all. Then she was gone. 12 minutes was an extremely long time in a mountain range with 4 active enemy fighters and a drone somewhere above the fog layer. Ethan knew this. His team knew this. They maintained their positions and their coverage without being told, spreading out into the terrain in the natural defensive formation that experience had made instinctive, and each of them dealt privately with the knowledge that they were waiting for someone they had known for less than 3 hours and trusted more than they could logically explain. Jordan Price checked his watch at 3-minute intervals. Webb didn't check his watch at all. He kept his eyes on the fog and his rifle where it needed to be. Holt monitored the transmission, which had continued intermittently short bursts that suggested a tactical communications protocol rather than a sustained information transfer. At 11 minutes and 40 seconds, Olivia came back. "East-southeast," she said, slightly out of breath for the first time. "The transmission is coming from east-southeast, not east-northeast." The directional error in Holt's initial read was because of the ridge deflection. The signal is bouncing off the northern face before it reaches this position. "East-southeast," Holt said, running it through his equipment immediately. "That puts the origin point at—" He stopped. "At what?" Ethan said. Holt looked up from his equipment. He had the expression of a man who had just calculated something that he wished he hadn't. "At the Coalition Forward Operating Base, 17 kilometers east-southeast, FOB Kellerman." FOB Kellerman, the forward operating base that served as the primary logistics and communications hub for Coalition special operations in this region. The base through which Ethan's team had been staged before deployment. The base where the mission planning materials had been stored, accessed, and briefed. The base where the access logs lived that Ethan had reviewed and found 6 names on when there should have been 7. The transmission they had been tracking wasn't coming from an enemy position. It was coming from their own base. The silence in the team was the particular silence of people absorbing information that restructures their understanding of a situation from the ground up. It wasn't shock. These were not people who shocked easily. It was the cognitive adjustment of experienced operators, realizing that the threat model they had been working with was incomplete in a way that changed their tactical options significantly. "Someone at FOB Kellerman is transmitting on a non-standard frequency," Ethan said. His voice was flat because he was keeping it flat deliberately. "Someone at FOB Kellerman with CENTCOM-level encryption," Holt said. "That's not a private. That's not a specialist. The hardware required for this encryption level is assigned to O5 and above or to specific intelligence positions regardless of rank." "How many people at Kellerman fit that profile?" Olivia said. Holt thought for a moment. 12, maybe 15. Counting intelligence officers, the communications section chief, and the senior operations staff. 12 to 15 people, one of whom had added their name to an access log after Ethan reviewed it. One of whom had passed specific operational detail to an enemy command structure. One of whom was transmitting right now from 17 kilometers away in what appeared to be a real-time coordination effort with whoever was directing the compound's defense. "They know we're alive," Webb said. "They know the compound's defensive screen failed, and they're trying to coordinate a response from Kellerman. Which means they have assets between us and the base, Olivia said. What kind of assets? Jordan said. I don't know yet, she said. But someone with CENTCOM-level access and enough operational authority to move pieces on this board doesn't improvise. They plan. Whatever is between us and Kellerman was positioned before this operation began in case it went wrong. Ethan turned the situation over in his mind, the way he turned every impossible problem, by breaking it into its components and addressing each one on its own terms before trying to reassemble them into something workable. Component 1. They had a drive containing communications intelligence from the compound. If the archive structure favored historical records over recent ones, that drive potentially contained the documentation of the intelligence compromise, names, dates, communication timestamps, the architecture of how information had been moving from inside the coalition to the enemy command structure. Component 2. The mole was at FOB Kellerman, transmitting on a non-standard frequency and apparently coordinating a response to the situation in the mountains. Component 3. They had 17 kilometers of terrain between their current position and the base terrain that might contain assets positioned specifically to prevent them from returning with the drive. Component 4. They couldn't report through standard channels because standard channels ran through the base and possibly through the specific communications infrastructure that the mole had access to. We need a communications path that doesn't go through Kellerman, Ethan said. SOCOM direct, Webb said immediately. We bypass the forward base entirely, go straight to Special Operations Command through the emergency channel. The encryption is separate, the pathway is separate, and it requires an authorization that only you have. If we transmit from here, the drone will reacquire us within minutes, Ethan said. Then we transmit while we're moving, Olivia said. You send the report, establish contact with SOCOM, and we cover distance at the same time. The drone can't track a moving transmission and guide fighters toward it simultaneously, not with the kind of processing lag that tactical drones carry in this terrain. How do you know what processing lag tactical drones carry in this terrain? Jordan said. Olivia looked at him. Because my mission brief included the enemy's electronic warfare assets in this region, including the drone. She paused. Which is a coalition-manufactured system that was reported as destroyed 8 months ago in an asset loss report. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than the previous one. A coalition-manufactured drone reported destroyed 8 months ago, now operating over the Koran range in support of an enemy command structure. It was never destroyed, Webb said. It was reported as destroyed, Olivia said, by whoever submitted the asset loss report. And then it disappeared from the inventory, from the records, from the tracking systems, from the accountability chain, and reappeared here in the hands of people who are using it to monitor coalition special operations missions. Ethan said very quietly. How long have you known about the drone? I identified it on day 2, she said. It's why I operated the way I did. No electronic emissions, no standard communication protocols. Nothing that would give a thermal imaging system a signature to track. I went dark because the drone made everything else dangerous. You've been working dark for 2 days, knowing there was a compromised coalition asset in the air above you, Ethan said. Yes. And you didn't find a way to report it. I tried, she said. On day 3, I attempted a burst transmission to my mission handler at J2. The transmission was jammed. Someone knew my frequencies. She held his gaze. Someone with access to my mission brief, which was filed through J2 through the same system that your mission was filed through. The same system. Same access infrastructure. Same vulnerability point. Different missions, different channels, same single point of failure. The person at Kellerman, who had read both briefs and had the authority to do something about both of them. Ethan made a decision that he would later describe in the classified after-action report that took 6 months to be fully processed and another 4 months to be appropriately acted upon as the clearest decision he had made in 11 years of field operations. Not because it was comfortable, because the logic was undeniable. We split, he said. Nobody spoke. Webb takes half the team on the primary route toward Kellerman. Direct fast as much noise as they need to make to keep the drone's attention. They carry one of Holt's secondary receivers as a decoy signal emitter and transmit intermittently on standard frequencies, to give whoever is tracking us a target to focus on. And the other half, Webb said. Olivia and I take the drive on a secondary route. No electronic emissions. We go completely dark. We get to a position where we can establish a SOCOM direct link without being jammed. We transmit the intelligence, and we arrange a secure extraction that doesn't go through Kellerman at all. Jordan said, "You're using us as bait. I'm using half the team as a decoy element that draws attention while the critical intelligence gets out through a pathway that isn't being monitored," Ethan said. The decoy element is 6 SEALs who know the terrain, know the threat, and know what they're doing. Nobody is being sacrificed. Nobody is being put in a position they can't handle. Jordan nodded once. He wasn't happy about it. He didn't need to be happy about it. He needed to understand it, and he did. "Webb," Ethan said. "You're leading the decoy element. Standard doctrine for contested extraction: make noise, make your movement readable, make the drone work for everything it gets. If you take contact, you are authorized to respond with full force. Don't protect yourselves less than the mission requires." "Understood," Webb said. "If you reach Kellerman before I've established SOCOM contact, you go to the base commander directly. Not the operations center, not the intelligence section. The base commander personally in his office with the door closed." Ethan reached into his pack and removed a sealed envelope. It had been there since the mission brief, a contingency document that commanders in his position always carried for situations where standard reporting chains failed. "Give him this. Don't let anyone else read it. Don't let anyone else in the room when he opens it." Webb took the envelope and secured it in an inner pocket. "What's in it?" Jordan said. "The 6 names from the access log," Ethan said. "And my assessment written before deployment that a 7th name exists. The base commander is not on that list and has no connection to the intelligence channels that were compromised. He's the one person at Kellerman I'm certain of." Webb checked his equipment, looked at his half of the team, and said, "We'll give the drone something worth watching." The 2 elements separated. 6 SEALs moved northeast, making controlled noise transmitting on standard frequencies, giving the surveillance assets above the fog layer exactly what they were designed to find. They moved with the deliberate readability of operators who understood that being noticed was the mission, a complete inversion of everything their training had built them for, and all the more difficult for it. Ethan, Olivia, and the remaining 4 SEALs moved west, completely silent. No transmissions, no electronic emissions. The kind of dark that made people feel acutely vulnerable because the technology they normally relied on to understand their environment was voluntarily offline. Olivia moved at Ethan's side slightly forward, the rifle slung and her hands free. She moved through the fog without hesitation, choosing paths that weren't obvious, navigating by memory and terrain sense, in a way that reminded Ethan that she had spent 4 days in this mountain range before he arrived, and that 4 days for someone like her was enough time to know a place the way a resident knows it, rather than the way a visitor does. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then Olivia stopped. Ethan stopped with her. The team stopped behind them. She didn't speak. She tilted her head at a specific angle, listening. Ethan had learned enough about her in the past 3 hours to understand that when she stopped and listened, the correct response was to be as silent as possible and wait for her to finish. 15 seconds. She turned to him and held up 3 fingers, then pointed west directly toward their intended route. 3 fighters. West. Ethan looked at the surrounding terrain. Their route was compromised. Adjusting it meant adding distance, adding time, moving further from the SOCOM transmission window that narrowed with every passing minute. The emergency channel had specific contact windows periods, when the satellite alignment allowed a burst transmission to reach SOCOM with minimum power output, which meant minimum electronic signature for the drone to detect. They had 1 window remaining in the next 4 hours, and it opened in approximately 22 minutes. 22 minutes. 3 fighters between them and the transmission position. He looked at Olivia. She was already looking at the 3 fighters' probable position through her scope, running calculations that existed entirely in her head. "I can take 2, she said barely above a whisper. "The 3rd will react and go to ground before I can reacquire. If he goes to ground in the right position, he pins us for longer than 22 minutes. Then we don't take them," Ethan said. "We don't have another route that reaches the transmission window in time." "Yes, we do," said Sergeant First Class Derek Holt from behind them. He had been quiet for so long that both Ethan and Olivia turned to look at him with something approaching surprise. Holt was the team member who spoke least and was most reliably right when he did. "If we go south another 400 meters, there's a ridge fold that gives us a clear approach angle to the transmission position without crossing the fighter's probable coverage zone. It adds 6 minutes to the route." "6 minutes puts us outside the window," Ethan said. "I can extend the window," Holt said. "The SOCOM emergency channel has a manual frequency extension protocol. If I initiate the protocol before the standard window opens, I can hold the channel for an additional 8 minutes on the back end." "Why didn't you mention this before?" Ethan said. "Because until 40 seconds ago, we didn't need it," Holt said. "Not defensively, just factually." Ethan processed this for exactly 2 seconds. "South, 400 meters, move." They moved south fast, with Olivia navigating, and Holt preparing the frequency extension protocol simultaneously, and the 3 fighters to the west never heard them because the fog swallowed sound, and Olivia chose her path the way she chose everything, with the precision of someone who had reduced the concept of error to something she simply refused to accommodate. At the 400-meter mark, Holt initiated the frequency extension. His hands moved across his equipment with the practiced economy of a technician who had done this before in worse conditions, and knew that the time the protocol required was exactly the time it required and not a second less. "Protocol running," he said. "Window opens in 4 minutes. We have until 19 minutes after standard window closure before the channel collapses." Ethan looked at Olivia. "If the drone is going to detect us, it'll be during the transmission. The southern approach puts a terrain feature between us and the drone's last known operating altitude," she said. "It's not a guarantee, but it's the best geometry available. Then it's what we use." 4 minutes. The team held position and waited, and the waiting was the hardest part. Not the movement, not the contact, not the decisions under pressure, but the 4 minutes of controlled stillness in a fog-covered mountain range with a compromised drone overhead and 3 enemy fighters to the west, and a mole at their own base, who was currently transmitting real-time coordination on a stolen coalition frequency. The window opened. Holt established contact. "SOCOM, this is Shadow 6 on emergency channel authorization, Col November 7-7, Kylo." Ethan set his voice absolutely steady. "I am transmitting a priority intelligence report from the Corin Range. I have a compromised coalition drone, a suspected intelligence mole, operating from FOB Kellerman and physical evidence on a communications drive pulled from a confirmed enemy relay station. I need a secure extraction arranged outside standard Kellerman channels. Acknowledge." Static. "Then, Shadow 6, SOCOM confirms contact. Transmit your report." Ethan transmitted. It took 6 minutes. 6 minutes of complete operational exposure. Electronic signature in the air position essentially fixed the drone above them, potentially reacquiring their location with every second that the transmission ran. Nobody on the team moved. Nobody spoke. They covered their sectors and waited for the transmission to complete, and understood that what was happening in those 6 minutes was the reason they had spent the previous 3 hours making every difficult decision correctly. The transmission completed. "SOCOM confirms receipt," the voice said. "Extraction is being arranged through a channel separate from Kellerman. Maintain radio silence until you reach extraction coordinates. Coordinates to follow on encrypted burst. Stand by." The burst came 30 seconds later. Holt decoded it and read the coordinates to Ethan without comment. Ethan looked at them, then at Olivia. "That's 9 kilometers south," he said. 3 hours of movement in this terrain," she said. "Maybe 2.5 if we push." "Shh," Ethan said. "There's something else," Olivia said. She had been looking at the decoded coordinate data over Holt's shoulder. "The extraction coordinates put us at a position that requires us to cross the same valley system where the compound is located. If the remaining fighters are redirected there, they'll be waiting for us," Ethan said. "Or they'll be waiting for Webb's element," she said. "Whoever the mole redirects them toward will depend on which element they believe carries the drive." Ethan looked at her. The decoy worked too well, he said slowly. If the mole thinks Webb's team has the drive, then Webb's team is not the decoy anymore, Olivia said. They're the target. The realization moved through the team in real time, visible in the small shifts of posture and expression that experienced operators couldn't entirely suppress when the situation changed in a way that affected someone they were responsible for. Ethan reached for his radio. "Don't," Holt said immediately, with an urgency that was completely unlike his usual measured delivery. "Any transmission right now tells the drone exactly where we are and confirms that this element is still operational. If the mole thinks Webb's team has the drive, us transmitting is the worst thing we can do. If we don't warn Webb is a chief petty officer with 11 years of operational experience," Olivia said. Her voice was not cold. It was simply clear in the way that clarity is necessary when emotion and logic are pulling toward different actions. "He knows the decoy role changes if the primary element goes dark. It's in his operational awareness, because it would be in any experienced operator's operational awareness." "She's right," Holt said. "I know she's right," Ethan said. He looked at the coordinates. He looked at the fog. He made the decision to trust Webb the same way he had made the decision to trust Olivia quickly, with incomplete information, accepting that the risk of inaction sometimes exceeded the risk of trust. "South," he said. "We move now and we don't stop." They moved, and in the fog above them, invisible, the drone that had once belonged to a coalition inventory turned its sensors across the mountain range, searching for the pattern that would tell whoever was watching its feed exactly which group of people to direct remaining assets toward. For the next 2 hours, Olivia Hayes moved at the front of a formation of 4 Navy SEALs and 1 SEAL commander through fog and cold, and the specific silence of mountains that are also occupied by people who want to find you. And she did not speak except when the terrain required it, and she did not slow except when the route required it, and she did not once look back at the fog the way people look back when they are afraid of what might be behind them. She had spent 4 days learning how to be afraid of this mountain range and survive it anyway. 2 more hours was nothing. 9 kilometers south, an extraction team was being assembled through a channel that the mole at FOB Kellerman had no access to. And in Ethan's pack, the drive that held the communications archive of an enemy relay station that was not supposed to exist moved through the mountains toward the people who would know what to do with it. The hardest part wasn't behind them. It was waiting 9 kilometers ahead. And somewhere in the fog to the north, 6 SEALs were moving through terrain that had just become significantly more dangerous than it was supposed to be, carrying a decoy signal toward a base where the person who wanted them to fail was already listening for exactly the sound they were making. They reached the valley crossing at the 2-hour mark, and the valley was wrong. Ethan felt it before he could articulate it, that specific quality of wrongness that 11 years of field operations had built into his nervous system like a secondary sense. Something in the pattern of the terrain, the distribution of sound, the quality of the silence itself had shifted from what it had been 20 minutes earlier when Olivia had last scanned ahead. Silence in a mountain range was not the absence of information. It was information. And what this silence was telling him was that the valley below had been occupied while they were descending toward it. Olivia had already stopped. She hadn't said anything. She didn't need to. She was prone on the ridge edge with the scope to her eye, and her breathing reduced to something barely measurable, and the fact that she had gone flat without instruction told Ethan everything about what she was seeing. He went down beside her. His 4 remaining SEALs spread and went low without a word. 8 fighters. Olivia said, her voice below a whisper. Distributed across the valley floor in a pattern that covers every natural crossing point. They weren't here 40 minutes ago. They were redirected, Ethan said. Fast redirection, she said. Someone moved them the moment the drone reacquired our general position. Whoever is running this response is not reacting. They're anticipating. Ethan looked at the valley. 9 kilometers south meant nothing if 8 fighters were positioned across the only viable crossing. They couldn't go around the terrain on both flanks, rose into cliff faces that would add 6 hours to the route and destroy the extraction window entirely. They couldn't go back. The northern route was compromised, and going back meant moving toward the compound's remaining assets and the drone's primary surveillance zone. They had one option, and it was the option nobody wanted. "We crossed through them," Ethan said. Olivia didn't argue. She looked at the distribution pattern again, working through the geometry, running the calculation that existed between the positions of 8 armed fighters and the specific capabilities of the people she was lying next to. "The eastern flank has a gap," she said, "between the second and third position. It's narrow 40 meters of unobserved ground between their coverage zones. The gap exists because of a terrain feature that blocks their mutual sightlines. It's not a planned gap, it's an accident of where they position themselves." "Can we get 4 people through a 40-meter gap without being seen?" Ethan said. "1 at a time, yes. 2 at a time, possibly. 4 simultaneously, no." "Then we go 1 at a time," Ethan said. "You cover the crossing from this position. 1 person moves, you watch their angles. If anyone gets eyes on the crossing point, you suppress before they can raise an alarm." Olivia looked at him with an expression that contained something she was deciding whether to say. "Say it," Ethan said. "If I fire from this position to cover the crossing, the muzzle signature tells the drone exactly where I am," she said. "Not approximately. Exactly. Whatever is in the air above us will have a confirmed firing position within seconds of the first shot." "I know," Ethan said. "And if the drone has that position, whatever response assets are still available, get directed here." "I know that too," Ethan said. "Which is why you cross last. We go through the gap, Jordan, Holt, Torres, then me. If anyone takes contact during the crossing, you suppress from here, and then you move immediately. You don't cover the full crossing from a static position. You cover the first contact you move, and you find a new position before the drone can lock your location." Olivia looked at him for a moment. "You've thought about this," she said. "I've been thinking about it for the past 40 minutes, he said. "While you were navigating." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite warmth. Not quite the guarded professionalism she'd maintained since the moment she'd stepped out of the fog in the ravine. Something that existed between those two things and didn't have a simple name. "All right," she said. Jordan went first. 40 meters of open ground between 2 enemy positions, moving at a crouch, using the cover of the terrain feature that created the gap. Taking 31 seconds that felt considerably longer to everyone watching from the ridge. He reached the southern side of the valley and went immediately to ground and gave the hand signal that meant clear. Holt went second. 28 seconds. Torres went third. He was halfway across when one of the eastern fighters shifted position, not toward the gap, not toward Torres, but a random adjustment that brought the fighter 2 meters closer to the edge of their coverage zone. Torres froze. Flat against the ground, completely still, in the specific way that requires an understanding that movement is the enemy of concealment, and that stillness, genuine stillness, is a discipline and not an instinct. The fighter looked in his direction, looked away. Torres moved again. He completed the crossing in 19 more seconds and was across before the fighter looked back. On the ridge, Ethan had watched the sequence with his hand very close to his radio and his eyes on Olivia, who had the scope on the eastern fighter the entire time, and whose trigger finger had been positioned with the specific precision of someone who had already made the decision to fire and was simply waiting for the threshold to be crossed. The threshold was not crossed. "Go," Olivia said without looking away from the scope. Ethan crossed. His 38 seconds were the longest of his operational career. Not because of what he experienced. He kept his movement controlled, his angles, managed his body low, and his pace deliberate, but because of what he was thinking about the whole time, which was Olivia covering him from a static position, with a drone in the air above them, and 8 fighters in the valley, and a mole, 17 kilometers away, who was watching everything that could be watched and directing everything that could be directed. He reached the south side. Behind him, after 40 seconds of nothing, Olivia came through the gap, not at a crouch. Completely flat, using a terrain depression that hadn't been visible from the ridge, moving with a slowness that was actually faster than the crouching approach, because it used cover that the upright approach couldn't access. She covered the 40 meters in what appeared to be a single continuous controlled movement, and she was across before Ethan had finished processing that she'd started. "East fighter is rotating toward his partner position," she said as she arrived. "Standard patrol rhythm. We have approximately 6 minutes before he completes the rotation and reacquires this side of the gap." "Move," Ethan said. They moved south. The next 3 kilometers went without contact, which Ethan understood was not luck. Olivia was navigating, and the routes she chose consistently placed terrain between them and the probable drone surveillance angles in a way that was not random. She was running a continuously updated model of the drone's coverage pattern, based on its last known operating altitude and its behavior over the past 4 days, and she was routing around it the way a ship's navigator routes around shoals. Not by avoiding the whole ocean, but by knowing exactly where the dangerous water was. Jordan moved up beside Ethan during a pause. "She's been doing this for 4 days, he said quietly. "Moving through this range with that thing in the air. Alone." "Yes," Ethan said. "How does someone develop that kind of—" Jordan stopped. He was trying to find the right word, and couldn't. "Discipline," Ethan said. "I was going to say something else," Jordan said. "I know," Ethan said. "But discipline is the part of it that's actually useful to think about. The rest of it is personal, and not ours." Jordan nodded. He dropped back. They were 4 kilometers from the extraction coordinates when Holt said, "Sir, traffic on Webb's frequency." Ethan stopped. "Webb's transmitting," he said. "Burst transmission, 30 seconds ago. I almost missed it because it was compressed." Holt worked his equipment for a moment. "Decoding now." 30 seconds. "Webb reports contact," Holt said. "His element took fire from a prepared position at the Valley Junction 3 kilometers north of Kellerman. 2 fighters down, they're continuing to advance. He's asking for—" Holt stopped. "For what?" Ethan said. Holt looked up. "He's asking whether the primary element made the SOCOM transmission." Ethan understood immediately what the question meant, and what it cost Webb to send it. Webb was taking fire moving through a prepared ambush, leading 5 people through terrain where someone had positioned fighters specifically to stop them. And his primary concern was whether the intelligence had gotten out. Not whether he would get backup, whether the mission had been accomplished. "Transmit confirmation," Ethan said. Short, compressed. "SOCOM transmission, complete drive, secure extraction in progress." "Transmitting will give the drone our position," Holt said. "Transmit," Ethan said. Holt transmitted. 5 seconds later. Olivia said, "Drone has adjusted. It's moving toward our position." She wasn't looking up at the sky. She couldn't see it through the fog. She was reading something in the ambient environment that Ethan couldn't read, some quality of the electronic interference pattern that she'd apparently learned to perceive over 4 days of dark operations beneath it. "How long before it's overhead?" Ethan said. 7 minutes, she said. "Maybe 8. How far to the extraction point?" 3.5 kilometers, she said. "At current pace, 25 minutes. The math was not good. "We need to move faster than current pace," Ethan said. "Faster pace means more noise," Jordan said. "More noise means the fighters in the valley potentially reacquire us." "The fighters in the valley are behind us," Olivia said. "By the time they complete the rotation pattern and realize we crossed, we'll have enough distance that noise doesn't matter. The drone is the problem. The drone can see what fighters can't." "Then we need to get back into a thermal shadow before it arrives overhead," Ethan said. Olivia was already scanning the terrain with her scope. "There's a ridge system 2 kilometers southwest. If we reach the eastern face of that ridge before the drone arrives overhead, we're in shadow. But the route requires crossing 800 meters of ground with no cover." 800 meters, 7 minutes, drone closing. "Run," Ethan said. They ran. Not the careful, controlled movement of the past 2 hours. Actual running across ground that was uneven and cold and fog-slicked in the specific way that special operations personnel run when the tactical situation has compressed past the point where caution is an affordable luxury. Ethan ran at the rear again, watching his team's spacing, keeping them together, managing the formation even at full pace, because a formation that loses its shape at speed is how people get separated in terrain like this. And separated in terrain like this was something he was not going to allow. Olivia ran at the front. She ran differently than she did everything else. Everything else she did had that quality of controlled precision of someone who had reduced the gap between intent and action to nearly zero. Running looked like the one thing she simply let herself do without calculation, and she was fast, genuinely surprisingly fast, for someone who had been in a mountain range for 4 days, on limited supplies, who had been grazed by around 3 hours earlier, and had tied off her own field dressing with one hand and her teeth. 6 minutes. They reached the 800-meter open stretch. "Don't stop," Olivia said. She didn't slow. She ran straight into it. Ethan followed. The feeling of 800 meters of open ground, with a drone less than 6 minutes away, and his team strung out across exposed terrain, was not a feeling that he would ever be entirely able to describe in the language of a formal report. The formal reports, when he eventually wrote them, would say something like, "Element crossed exposed terrain under time pressure from aerial surveillance asset." What the formal report would not say was that every step of that 800 meters was a calculation about whether the next step was still the right decision, and that doing the calculation correctly required him to trust not just his own judgment, but the judgment of the person at the front of the formation who was navigating on the basis of 4 days of knowledge he didn't have. Trust had always been an operational necessity for Ethan Cole. In 11 years, he had never trusted someone he had known for 4 hours with this specific weight of decision. He ran. They crossed. The eastern face of the ridge system received them into thermal shadow 2 minutes and 40 seconds before the drone arrived at their last confirmed position. Olivia went flat against the rock face, and the team compressed around her, and nobody moved for 90 seconds while the drone made its pass. Nobody breathed loudly. Nobody moved. Olivia's hand against the rock face was completely still. The drone passed. Moved on. Ethan exhaled. Beside him, Jordan made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and was probably the most honest sound any of them had made in the past 4 hours. 90 seconds, Jordan said. "We made it by 90 seconds. 87, Olivia said. She pushed off the rock face and straightened. "We need to keep moving. The drone will complete its sweep pattern and return to this area in approximately 15 minutes. 15 minutes, Holt said. "We're 2 kilometers from extraction. At pace we can make it in 14. "Then we move at pace," Ethan said. "Holt, is there any update from SOCOM on the extraction status?" "Last confirmation was on schedule," Holt said. "But that was 40 minutes ago. A lot has changed in 40 minutes. "It has," Ethan said. "Get me a status when we're 1 kilometer out. Short burst compressed, same protocol as before." "The transmission will." "I know what it will do," Ethan said. "We'll deal with it when it happens." They moved. 1 kilometer from the extraction point, Holt transmitted the status request. The drone, as predicted, adjusted its pattern toward the transmission source. This time the adjustment was faster. It had been learning their behavior, or whoever was watching its feed had been learning their behavior and adjusting its tasking accordingly. The response from SOCOM came in 11 seconds. "Extraction on schedule. Be advised, FOB Kellerman has been placed under a communications blackout by SOCOM authority, effective 30 minutes ago. All outgoing transmissions from Kellerman are suspended pending a security review. Be further advised, a SOCOM security team is en route to Kellerman to take custody of a person of interest. Authorization, Cole November 7-7 Kilo confirmed. Maintain current route." Ethan absorbed this while moving. The communications blackout. 30 minutes ago. SOCOM had locked down FOB Kellerman's ability to transmit anything, which meant that 30 minutes ago, approximately 20 minutes after Ethan's SOCOM transmission had been received and processed, someone at a level above FOB Kellerman had decided that the intelligence Ethan had provided was credible enough to act on immediately. The mole at Kellerman had been cut off. Whatever they had been transmitting to the fighters in the mountains, whatever real-time coordination they had been providing, it had stopped 30 minutes ago. And the fighters in the valley, the drone above the mountains, whatever assets had been positioned between Ethan's team and the extraction point, they were now operating without direction, without the real-time intelligence feed that had made them effective. "They're blind," Ethan said. Olivia understood immediately. The fighters in the valley lost their direction source 30 minutes ago. That's why the valley crossing was cleaner than it should have been. They were waiting for instructions that stopped coming. And the drone, Jordan said. The drone is running on its last tasked parameters, Olivia said. Without a handler providing updated direction, it's cycling its pre-programmed patrol pattern, which means its behavior becomes predictable. You can predict its pattern, Holt said. I've watched it for 4 days, she said. I know its pattern. She knew its pattern. Of course she did. 4 days alone in a mountain range operating dark, studying the behavior of an aerial surveillance asset that shouldn't have existed, learning its rhythms and its coverage zones and its rotation intervals, the way a person learns the behavior of something dangerous that they cannot afford to be surprised by. The extraction point was 300 meters ahead. 200 meters from the extraction point, the first sign of the inbound aircraft became audible. Not the sound of rotors, which would come later, but the specific quality of changed air pressure that preceded a helicopter's arrival in mountain terrain. Ethan had felt it hundreds of times. It was one of the most reliably welcome feelings he knew. 100 meters. Then Holt said, "Sir, Webb's frequency. Incoming." Ethan grabbed the receiver. Webb's voice came through compressed and slightly degraded, but perfectly clear in its essential content. Primary element has reached Kellerman perimeter. No resistance at the wire. Base is locked down. Nobody in, nobody out. We've been met by base security, who say they're acting on SOCOM instructions. Commander says to tell you. A pause, some degradation. Then, Commander says to tell you the envelope was exactly what he needed. The access log, the 7th name. What's the name? Ethan said. A longer pause. Colonel Richard Sauer, Webb said. Deputy Operations Officer. He was in the access log under a credentials flag that would only show up if you knew to look for it. Commander found it in 30 seconds once he knew to look. Colonel Richard Sauer, Deputy Operations Officer at FOB Kellerman. The person responsible for coordinating special operations mission planning at the forward base level. The person with access to every mission brief that moved through the Kellerman Operations Center. The person with the institutional authority to add a name to an access log in a way that would only show up under specific search criteria. And Ethan understood immediately the person with sufficient seniority and operational knowledge to know exactly what the enemy needed to know. To position 3 snipers on a north ridge, redirect a drone to cover a mountain range, and place fighters at every natural crossing point between an infiltrating team and their extraction site. Is he in custody? Ethan said. SOCOM security team arrived at Kellerman 9 minutes ago, Webb said. He was at his desk. He didn't run. He just... Another pause, and when Webb's voice came back, there was something in it that wasn't quite what Ethan had come to associate with Webb's register, something that sat closer to disbelief than anything tactical. He just sat there, sir. When they came in, he sat there and looked at his desk. Ethan had seen that before. Not often. But he had seen it the moment when someone who had been carrying the weight of sustained deception for months or years finally reached the point where the weight was lifted, not by their own choice, but by circumstance. And the reaction was not panic, not anger, not the defensive aggression that most people expected. The reaction was something closer to relief. The terrible, complicated relief of a person who was finally done. Webb, Ethan said. Good work. Good work to you, sir, Webb said. The drive is the key thing, whatever's on that drive. We know what's on it, Ethan said. Keep your team at Kellerman until the SOCOM security team clears your element. Don't talk to anyone from the Kellerman operations staff until the security team has cleared each individual personally. Already doing that, Webb said. The connection ended. 50 meters from the extraction point, Ethan looked at Olivia. She had heard the transmission. She had heard Webb's voice say the name Richard Sauer, heard the words Deputy Operations Officer, heard the description of a man sitting at his desk when the people came to take him. She was walking with the same controlled precision. She always walked with rifle-slung eyes moving across the terrain in the automatic scan of someone who was never entirely not working. But something in her posture had shifted slightly. Ethan recognized it after a moment. It was the physical expression of something being resolved. Not completed intelligence breaches of this scale were never resolved in a single moment, and the implications of what Richard Sauer had done would take months to fully understand and years to fully remediate. But the immediate question, the question of who had done it, and whether there was enough evidence to act, was resolved. The drive was in Holt's pack. The SOCOM transmission had been received and acted upon. Webb's element was safe. The mole was in custody. The immediate question was resolved. "You knew there was a breach before this mission started," Ethan said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation made carefully because the way she had operated for 4 days suggested a level of operational caution that exceeded her mission brief even before she encountered his team. Olivia was quiet for 3 steps. "I suspected," she said. "My previous mission 4 months ago in a different region went wrong in a way that resembled this. Specific intelligence failures at specific points. I wrote a report. The report went through J2. Nothing happened." "Because the report went through the same system that Sauer had access to," Ethan said. "My assessment," she said. "Yes." "So you came back out here." "I requested this assignment," she said. "I requested the solo reconnaissance parameter specifically because I needed to operate in a way that didn't generate a mission brief detailed enough for the breach to act on. My mission existed in the system, but the operational parameters were vague enough that anyone reading them would know I was in the Corin range and not much else. And the 4 days of intelligence you gathered was the evidence I couldn't produce through official channels," she said. "I came here to build a case. I just didn't expect to encounter a SEAL team that gave me the means to transmit it." Ethan looked at her. "You weren't just doing reconnaissance," he said. "No," she said. "I was doing what needed to be done because the people who should have done it through proper channels hadn't done it." She paused. "I'm aware that's not how it's supposed to work." "It's exactly how it worked," Ethan said. "Which is the only thing that matters at this particular moment." 20 meters from the extraction point, the sound of rotors became audible. Not the tentative distant sound of an aircraft that might be heading somewhere else. The direct purposeful sound of an aircraft that knew where it was going and was arriving. The helicopter came out of the fog. The way Olivia had come out of the fog in the ravine, appearing from gray, nothing. Materializing into solid presence. Settling into a landing pattern, with the practiced efficiency of a crew that had been briefed on the situation and understood what was required of them. Not a standard Kellerman asset. An aircraft with different markings operated by a crew that Ethan didn't recognize, which was the confirmation he needed that SOCOM had done exactly what they said they would do, arranged an extraction through a completely separate channel. Jordan Torres reached the aircraft first and turned back to look at the team with an expression that combined exhaustion and relief in proportions that probably matched everyone else's internal state exactly. "I'm getting in the helicopter," he said, with the simple, direct sincerity of a person who has been in a mountain range for too long and is making a definitive statement about what happens next. Holt was already moving past him. Ethan stopped at the aircraft door and looked back at the terrain they had come through. The fog. The ridge systems. The valley crossing. The 800-meter open stretch and the 90-second margin that had existed between them and exposure. The gap between 2 enemy fighters, through which 5 people had passed one at a time, while someone held a scope on angles that would have gone wrong without her. He turned back to the aircraft. Olivia was the last one, in which was what he'd expected, because she was the kind of person who looked at an aircraft door and calculated whether everyone who needed to be through it was through it before she stepped through it herself. She sat across from Ethan. The aircraft lifted. Through the window. The fog that had been their concealment, and their obstacle, and their operational environment. For the past 6 hours, thinned and disappeared as the aircraft climbed above it. Below them, the Corin range was gray and featureless and cold, and nothing visible suggested that anything had happened there. Which was, Ethan reflected, exactly how the best operations looked from altitude. Jordan, who had been quiet since getting on the aircraft, said, "Colonel Sauer, how long do you think he was running?" "The communications history on the drive will tell us," Holt said. "But your estimate," Jordan said. "Your gut." Holt thought for a moment. "The access modification technique he used requires sustained familiarity with the system. That kind of familiarity takes time, 18 months minimum, possibly longer. 18 months. 18 months of missions that had gone wrong in ways that looked like operational friction. 18 months of high-value targets who had moved before coalition forces could reach them. 18 months of defensive preparations that exceeded what the available intelligence should have produced. 18 months of things that looked like bad luck and were actually something else entirely. Ethan thought about the operations he knew had failed in this region over the past 2 years. The patterns that intelligence analysts had attributed to improving enemy capability and operational security. The assessments that had been written and briefed and accepted because the alternative explanation that the failure was internal was harder to accept and harder to prove. Olivia was looking at the fog below the aircraft. "What happens now?" Jordan said. He was asking Ethan, but his eyes moved to Olivia. "Now the drive goes to people who can read it," Ethan said. Sauer goes through the process. Every mission that touched the Kellerman Operations Center in the past 18 months gets reviewed. He paused. "And we write our reports." "My report is going to be very long," Holt said. "Mine too," said Torres from the back of the aircraft, which was his first complete sentence in approximately 40 minutes, and produced a brief, genuine laugh from Jordan that cut through the exhaustion and the residual tension of the past 6 hours with the particular efficiency that only genuine absurdity can produce. Ethan looked at Olivia. "Your after-action report," he said. "Are you going to include the J2 report you filed 4 months ago, the one that went through the system and disappeared?" "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "Because the people who receive your report this time are going to want to know that you tried the proper channels first. It matters." She looked at him. "Why?" she said. "Because the system failed you before you went around it," he said. "That's not a small distinction. That's the difference between someone who operates outside established protocols because it's convenient, and someone who operates outside established protocols because the established protocols had been specifically compromised to prevent the information from reaching the people who needed it." He paused. "Your 4 months ago, report your 4 days in this mountain range. The fact that you tried to transmit on day 3 and were jammed, all of it establishes that the failure was in the system, not in your judgment." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "You're protecting my record," she said. "I'm describing the situation accurately," he said. "Which is what a report is supposed to do." She looked at him for a long moment with those older-than-they-should-be eyes, and whatever she was thinking stayed inside. But something in her expression shifted in the way that very private people's expressions shift when something has reached them that they weren't expecting. "Thank you," she said. Below the aircraft, the fog covered the Corin Range completely, and nothing visible remained of what had happened there. The 3 snipers on the North Ridge, the valley crossing the drive in Holt's pack, the name on the 7th line of an access log that a man had added in the specific belief that it would never be found. It had been found, because 4 days before a 12-man SEAL team arrived in those mountains, a woman had climbed into the fog alone and stayed there until she had what she came for. And because 18 months of wrong answers had finally produced the right question asked by the right person, at the only moment when asking it could still make a difference. The aircraft moved south. The mountains disappeared behind them. The debrief began 4 hours after the aircraft landed, not at FOB Kellerman. Kellerman was still locked down, still being processed by the SOCOM security team that had arrived in 2 separate aircraft within 30 minutes of Ethan's transmission, and the base that had been the operational hub for coalition special operations in the region was now temporarily a crime scene. Personnel were confined to their quarters. Communications remained suspended. The operations center where Colonel Richard Sauer had spent 18 months reading mission briefs that were never meant for his eyes was sealed behind security tape and the quiet, methodical presence of investigators who understood exactly what they were looking at and exactly how significant it was. The debrief happened at a staging facility 60 kilometers south, a building that existed in the coalition's administrative structure as a logistics coordination point, and in practical reality, as the kind of place where things that couldn't happen in the normal chain of command happened anyway quietly, without leaving footprints in the standard documentation. Ethan had been in rooms like this before. He had never been in one where the stakes of the conversation were quite this clearly defined. The room held 8 people when the debrief began. A 2-star general named Hargrove, who had flown in from the regional command structure and who Ethan had met twice before, under completely different circumstances. A civilian intelligence officer who introduced himself only by a first name that Ethan was reasonably certain was not his actual first name. 2 SOCOM investigators who sat with laptops open and said almost nothing for the first hour. Webb, who had arrived from Kellerman 40 minutes earlier, looking like a man who had run through an ambush and then been held at a base perimeter for 3 hours, and was managing the accumulated exhaustion of both experiences with the particular compressed energy of someone who had not yet been given permission to stand down. Holt, who had the drive in a hardened case that he had not released to anyone yet, because Ethan had not told him to release it. And Olivia Hayes, who sat at the far end of the table with her hands folded in front of her, and the stillness of someone who had been in difficult rooms before, and understood that the way you occupied space in a difficult room communicated as much as anything you said. General Hargrove opened without preamble. "Colonel Sauer has been read his rights and has requested counsel," he said. "He has not made a statement. The SOCOM security team has secured his personal equipment, his office communications infrastructure, and his access credentials. The Kellerman Operations Center is currently being imaged by a forensic team." He looked at the drive in Holt's case. "That is currently the most significant piece of physical evidence we have. Before I ask Petty Officer Holt to transfer it to the investigators, I want to hear the full operational account from Lieutenant Cole and Captain Hayes. Everything, in sequence. Starting from the moment each of you entered the Corin range." Ethan spoke for 40 minutes. How was precise, sequential, and complete the kind of after-action account that his training had built him to produce, stripping the experience of everything that wasn't operationally relevant and presenting what remained in the order that it had occurred. He described the insertion, the sniper contact, the moment Olivia had appeared from the fog. He described the ravine, the intelligence she'd provided, the drive extraction, the valley crossing. He described the SOCOM transmission, the thermal shadow, the 90-second margin. He described Webb's contact at the Valley Junction and the communications blackout that had confirmed SOCOM's response to his report. He described everything. When he finished, Hargrove looked at Olivia. She spoke for 35 minutes. She was different from Ethan in the way she delivered it, not less precise, not less complete, but organized around the evidence rather than around the events. She presented 4 days of observational intelligence in a sequence that built toward a conclusion. The way a legal argument builds toward a verdict. Each piece of information establishing the foundation for the next, the whole structure becoming unmistakable before she reached the end of it. The communications upgrade on day 2. The sniper positioning pattern that exceeded standard defensive doctrine. The drone that wasn't in any coalition inventory. The jammed transmission on day 3. The data extraction attempt and the 90-second window before she severed the uplink. When she described the J2 report she had filed 4 months earlier, the civilian intelligence officer, the one with the probably not real first name, stopped typing and looked at her directly for the first time. "That report came through our office," he said. "Yes," Olivia said. "It was assessed as inconclusive and filed as a low-priority anomaly report." "Yes," she said again. "I'm aware of how it was assessed. I'm also aware that the assessment was made by an analyst whose work was reviewed by the Deputy Operations Officer at Kellerman as part of the standard intelligence coordination process." The room was quiet. "Sauer reviewed the assessment," the civilian said. "The coordination record shows his credentials accessed the file," Olivia said. 3 days after I submitted it, and 4 days after that accessed the operational environment in my subsequent mission area, changed in ways consistent with the enemy having received warning." She placed a small folded paper on the table. Handwritten. The same shorthand from the notebook she'd shown Ethan in the ravine. "I've been keeping a parallel record," she said. "Off system, on paper, for 4 months. Everything I observed, everything I reported, and every instance where the operational consequences suggested that the report had been seen by someone who was not supposed to see it." She paused. "I brought it because I knew the digital trail inside the system had been managed. Paper doesn't get managed." Hargrove looked at the paper for a long moment. Then he looked at the civilian intelligence officer. "How long has this been in front of us?" he said. It was not a question with an upward inflection at the end. It was the kind of statement that generals make when they have arrived at an understanding that they are angry about and are choosing to express the anger through precision rather than volume. "The initial report was 4 months ago," the civilian said. "If the assessment was influenced." "If," Hargrove said. The single word carried the weight of everything that had happened in the Corin Range in the past 18 hours. The civilian did not say anything else. Hargrove looked at Olivia. "Captain Hayes, you operated outside your mission parameters for 4 days in a hostile environment, without backup, without standard communication, and without informing your chain of command of your actual objectives." "Yes, sir," she said. "You did this because you believed your chain of command had been compromised at a level that made standard reporting dangerous." "Yes, sir." "And your assessment of that compromise has been substantially validated by subsequent events." "The drive will validate it completely," she said. "Or it won't, but I believe it will." Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. Ethan watched the general's face during that moment and saw something that he had seen very rarely in the faces of flag officers during difficult conversations: genuine uncertainty. Not about what had happened, about what to do with a person who had done something that was simultaneously a serious breach of protocol and the single action most responsible for the breakthrough that everyone in the room was now sitting with. "Release the drive," Hargrove said to Holt. Holt looked at Ethan. Ethan nodded once. Holt opened the case, removed the drive, and placed it on the table. One of the SOCOM investigators picked it up, examined it briefly, and connected it to a hardened analysis laptop. The room waited while the device was cataloged and its contents inventoried. 3 minutes. The investigator looked up. "The archive is intact. Communications dating back 22 months, approximately 4,000 discrete message threads." He paused. "There are encryption signatures on the outgoing communications that match a CENTCOM registered credential set." Another pause. "The credential registration name is Richard Sauer." 22 months, not 18. 22. Ethan heard Webb across the table exhale a single controlled breath. It was the sound of a number landing harder than expected. 22 months of Colonel Richard Sauer, reading mission briefs and passing operational detail through an enemy communications infrastructure that a relay station in the Corin Mountains had served as the hub for. 22 months of operations, compromised targets, warned defensive preparations that exceeded what available intelligence should have produced. 22 months of things that looked like bad luck. "Every failed operation in this region over the past 2 years needs to be reviewed," Hargrove said. He was looking at the drive but speaking to the room. "Everyone. Personnel losses, target acquisitions that came up, empty intelligence assessments that turned out to be wrong in specific directional ways." He paused. "This is going to be a significant piece of work. It's going to be a very significant piece of work," the civilian said quietly. For the first time, something in his voice sounded less like a professional managing a situation, and more like a person absorbing the full weight of what the situation actually meant. The debrief broke at the 2-hour mark for a 15-minute recess that most people used to get coffee or water, or simply to stand in a corridor and breathe air that wasn't the recycled compressed air of a room where 22 months of damage was being systematically accounted for. Ethan found Olivia in the corridor. She was standing with a cup of water. She wasn't drinking, looking at the wall with the focused non-focus of someone processing a very large amount of information through a system that was running close to its limits after 4 days in a mountain range and 4 hours in a debrief room. "You should eat something," he said. "I'll eat when this is done," she said. "It's going to be a while before this is done," he said. She looked at him. "I know." He stood beside her for a moment, not saying anything. Sometimes the most useful thing you could offer another person was the specific quality of silence that communicated you were present without requiring them to do anything with your presence. After a moment, Olivia said, 22 months. "Yes," Ethan said. "I thought 18, she said. "My earliest traceable anomaly was 18 months ago. I missed 4 months. She paused. 4 months where the pattern was there and I didn't see it. You were working from outside the system with limited access to the complete operational record, Ethan said. The fact that you identified 18 months of a 22-month breach from a position of deliberate operational isolation without being able to access the classified databases that would have confirmed what you were seeing, that's not a failure. That's the opposite of a failure. People died in those 4 months, she said. Operations that went wrong, personnel who didn't come back. If I'd seen it earlier. You reported what you saw, Ethan said. 4 months ago through proper channels. The system failed to act on it. That's not on you. She was quiet. I keep running it back, she said. The calculation. What I saw when I saw it, what I reported, what I should have done differently. That's a calculation with no useful answer, Ethan said. You did what you could with what you had at the point you had it. The only version of events where you could have caught this. 4 months earlier requires you to have had information you didn't have working in a system that wasn't compromised, reporting to a chain of command that wasn't selectively filtered by the person doing the compromising. He paused. You can't outperform the structure of the problem you're working inside. You did the next best thing, you went outside the structure. She looked at him. When did you get philosophical? She said. Something that might have been a smile crossed his face. About 2 hours into a mountain range, where a woman I'd known for 40 minutes was making better decisions than I was, he said. It produces a certain amount of reflection. She looked away. But something in her posture had shifted that quality of accumulated self-directed weight that had been sitting on her since the moment the number 22 had been spoken in the debrief room lightened slightly. Not gone. Not resolved. But lightened in the way that weight lightens when someone who has been carrying it alone is reminded that they don't have to perform that particular act alone anymore. They went back into the room. The second hour of the debrief was different from the first. The first hour had been accounting, the operational narrative, the evidence, the sequence of events. The second hour was interrogative in a more targeted way, focused on specific details that the investigators needed to establish the legal and intelligence framework around what the drive had already begun to reveal. Hargrove asked Olivia directly. When you filed the J2 report 4 months ago, did you retain a copy outside the system? Yes, she said. Where? She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and removed a folded paper. She placed it on the table beside the handwritten record she'd already provided. The civilian intelligence officer looked at the 2 documents, then at Olivia. You've been maintaining a paper record for 4 months, he said, while continuing to operate on standard missions. Yes, she said, with the explicit expectation that the digital record inside the system was compromised. With the assessed likelihood that it was, she said. Explicit expectation seemed premature until I had something that corroborated the assessment. And now you do. And now you do, she said. The correction was gentle, precise. The paper and the drive were on the table, and the people who could act on them were in the room, and her role in this particular aspect of the process was essentially complete. Webb, who had been quiet for most of the second hour, spoke from across the table. Sir, he said to Hargrove, the decoy element, my 6 people. I need to know they're cleared to stand down. They've been at Kellerman perimeter for 3 hours, and they haven't been officially briefed on the outcome. They'll be briefed within the hour, Hargrove said. They're cleared to stand down. Full operational stand down, 48-hour minimum rest protocol. He looked at Ethan. That applies to your entire element. And Captain Hayes, Ethan said. Hargrove looked at Olivia. Captain Hayes is technically under a different command authority than your element. Her stand-down protocol runs through her J2 mission handler. He paused. Who we are currently in the process of reviewing, given that Sauer had access to J2 coordination materials. Olivia absorbed this without visible reaction, pending review of her command authority chain. Hargrove continued. Captain Hayes will be attached to Lieutenant Cole's element for administrative purposes. Stand-down applies equally. It was a bureaucratic solution to a bureaucratic problem, stated in the language of administrative process. It was also Ethan understood Hargrove's way of ensuring that Olivia Hayes was not left in an institutional gray area while the investigation worked its way through the command structure that had in various ways failed her for 4 months. The general was beneath the rank and the operational authority. A person who understood what the right thing looked like and was capable of doing it through the mechanisms available to him. "Thank you, sir," Ethan said. Hargrove nodded once and moved on. The debrief ended at the 4-hour mark. As the room cleared, the civilian intelligence officer stopped beside Olivia. He had the paper record and the J2 report copy in a secure folder. He looked at her with an expression that contained, for the first time since she'd walked into the room, something genuinely personal. "The report you filed 4 months ago," he said. "I want you to know that it did reach my desk. I reviewed it personally." Olivia looked at him. "I assessed it as inconclusive," he said. "I made that assessment based on the analytical summary that was prepared by the section that Sauer's credentials had accessed." He paused. "I was working from a corrupted foundation, and I didn't know it. I want you to understand that if I had read the raw report, the actual observations, without the analytical filter that sat between your report and my desk, I would have acted on it." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "I believe you," she said. And she did, because the alternative, that the failure had been deliberate all the way up. The chain was a version of events she had considered and found less consistent with the pattern of what had actually happened. Sauer had been careful precisely because he understood that the system he was exploiting would turn against him if it could see clearly enough. He had inserted himself into the analytical layer, the filtering process between raw intelligence and the people who acted on it, because that was where information could be shaped without appearing to be shaped. "What happens to the analytical process while the review is ongoing?" she said. "We rebuild it from the raw intelligence up," the civilian said. "Starting with everything that touched Kellerman operations in the past 22 months. It will be slow. It will be disruptive. A significant portion of the regional operational picture will need to be reevaluated from scratch." He paused. "But it will be accurate when we're done. For the first time in almost 2 years, it will be actually accurate." He left. Olivia stood in the emptying room for a moment. Then she picked up her rifle, slung it muzzle down the way she always carried it, and walked out. Ethan was in the corridor. "They're arranging transport back to your home base," he said. 40 minutes. "I know," she said. 48-hour stand down," he said. "I heard the general," she said. "What will you do with 48 hours?" he said. She thought about this. It was a genuine question, and she gave it a genuine answer. "Sleep," she said, "for probably most of it." "Good," he said. Webb appeared from the far end of the corridor, moving with the specific energy of a man who had received official clearance to stop moving, and was using that clearance to move toward the nearest food source with considerable purpose. He stopped when he saw them. 48 hours, he said to Ethan. "I'm going to eat an entire prepared meal, sleep for approximately 14 hours, and then eat another entire prepared meal." "That's a solid plan," Ethan said. Webb looked at Olivia. He had the expression of a man who had something to say and was deciding how to say it without it becoming more than what it needed to be. "Captain Hayes," he said. "In 11 years, I have never watched anyone take 3 shots at over 2,000 meters in fog in sequence in under 40 minutes and put every single one exactly where it needed to go." He paused. "I also want to acknowledge that the first shot, the one that landed 3 inches from Kowalski's boot on the North Ridge, was the most specifically accurate warning I have ever personally experienced, and I mean that as a compliment." Olivia looked at him. "Thank you," she said, simply, without the guardedness that had been in everything she said for most of the day. Because Webb had offered something without asking for anything in return, and she understood the difference. Webb nodded once and continued toward the food. Jordan Price came out of the debrief room carrying 2 cups of coffee with the careful concentration of someone who had decided this was the most important logistical task currently available to him. He handed one to Ethan, then looked at Olivia and immediately went back through the door to get a third. When he came back, he handed it to her and said, "I don't know how you take it." "Black," she said. "That's how everyone on this team takes it," he said. "It's like a requirement." "Maybe it is," she said. Something shifted in the corridor, the particular quality of ease that settles over people who have been through something extremely difficult together and have arrived intact on the other side of it. Not celebration, Not the release of tension that movies showed, the backslapping and the loud exhaling and the sudden volume. Something quieter than that. Something that existed between people who had operated at the edge of what was possible and come through it, and were now standing in a corridor drinking bad coffee and finding that the ordinary texture of a moment, the warmth of a cup, the presence of other people, the absence of immediate threat was sufficient. More than sufficient. The 40 minutes before transport passed in fragments of conversation that Ethan would remember afterward, not for their content, but for their quality. The way people talked when the weight had lifted, and the words didn't need to carry anything except themselves. Holt explained to nobody who had asked the specific mathematical relationship between transmission compression ratios and satellite window timing. And Jordan listened with the expression of someone who was not following, but was enjoying the sound of expertise operating freely in a low-stakes environment. Torres fell asleep, sitting against the corridor wall, and nobody woke him until the transport was 2 minutes out. Webb returned from the food area with a quantity of packaged provisions that exceeded what any reasonable person could consume in 40 minutes and distributed them without comment. Olivia sat beside Ethan and drank her coffee and didn't say much. At one point, Ethan said, "The J2 investigation is going to pull you into a lot of follow-on debriefs." "I know," she said. "Your paper record is going to be central to establishing the timeline," he said. 4 months of parallel documentation. It's going to be significant." "I know that too," she said. "You planned for this," he said. "Not just the 4 days in the mountains, the 4 months before it. You were building toward this specific outcome." She looked at her coffee cup. "I was building toward the outcome where someone with the authority to act on the evidence had the evidence," she said. "I didn't know what form it would take. I didn't know it would be a 12-man SEAL team and a communications drive and a SOCOM transmission from a thermal shadow with 90 seconds to spare." She paused. "I just knew that the evidence had to exist somewhere outside the system that had been compromised, and that someone had to carry it there." "So you carried it," Ethan said. "Someone had to," she said. The transport arrived. They filed out in the order that people file out when they are tired and fed, and the immediate crisis has passed without particular ceremony, without the formation discipline that the operational environment had required in the loose and human way of a group of people who have earned the right to be loose and human for a few hours. Olivia was the last out. At the door. Hargrove was waiting. Not standing in the doorway, standing to the side, the way a person stands when they want to speak to someone specifically and are waiting for the right moment rather than creating one by authority. "Captain Hayes," he said. She stopped. "Your after-action report," he said. "I want it filed directly to my office, not through J2, not through any Kellerman-adjacent administrative channel, directly to me." "Understood, sir," she said. "Additionally," he said, "I'm initiating a formal review of the J2 report you filed 4 months ago and the circumstances of its assessment. When that review is complete, the record is going to reflect what actually happened." He paused. "All of it, including what you reported when you reported it and why the system failed to act on it." Olivia looked at him. "The record mattering is not why I filed it," she said. "I know," Hargrove said. "That's exactly why it needs to matter." She nodded once. He extended his hand. She shook it. And then she walked out to the transport into the early evening air that was cold in the way of high terrain, even at lower elevation, and she climbed in with the rest of the team, and the transport moved south toward the base where 48 hours of stand-down was waiting, and a meal and sleep, and the ordinary structure of a life that had been suspended for 4 days in a fog-covered mountain range, for reasons that had now been fully established and would take the better part of 2 years to fully remediate. The drive that Holt had carried out of the Koran Mountains took 14 months to fully process. The communications archive it contained established Richard Sauer's relationship with the enemy command structure with a precision that left no interpretive gap. 22 months of contact, 47 discrete operational disclosures, 31 missions compromised at the planning level. 11 operations that had failed in ways now understood to be direct results of specific intelligence passed to specific people at specific moments. 6 personnel losses that the review board in its final report attributed in whole or in part to intelligence that had moved through Sauer's hands before it moved through the mountains. Sauer did not testify at his court-martial. His counsel entered a plea on his behalf, and the proceeding moved with a clarity and speed unusual for cases of this complexity. Unusual and yet entirely logical, given that the Communications Archive had produced a level of documented evidence that left nothing to argue about. He was convicted on 11 counts. The sentence was not made public. The review of J2 analytical processes that followed the investigation produced 47 specific procedural recommendations, 32 of which were adopted in full and implemented within 6 months. The analytical layer between raw field intelligence and the decision-makers who acted on it was rebuilt from the structure up with specific attention to the filtering points where a single individual's credential access could shape the information that reached the level above without leaving a traceable footprint. Olivia Hayes's J2 report from 4 months before the Corin operation was formally re-evaluated under the new analytical framework. The re-evaluation concluded that the report properly analyzed, without the corrupted filter that Sauer's access had allowed him to apply, had contained sufficient information to identify the intelligence compromise and initiate a counterintelligence investigation at the time of filing. The formal record was amended to reflect this conclusion. Ethan Cole's after-action report was classified at a level that meant most people who needed to understand what had happened in the Corin Range would never read it. But the people who needed to read it, read it, and the people who needed to act on it, acted on it, and the specific operational landscape that Sauer's 22 months had distorted began slowly and with the particular difficulty of rebuilding something that had been deliberately corrupted, rather than simply damaged, to return to something accurate. 3 months after the Corin operation, Ethan received a message through official channels. Not a long message, short, 3 sentences. The follow-on J2 debriefs are complete. The record reflects what happened. Thank you for what you said in the corridor. No signature. He didn't need one. He wrote back 2 words, you earned it. 6 months after the Corin operation, a new standing protocol was implemented across Coalition Special Operations mission planning in the region. The protocol required that any mission brief involving a solo reconnaissance element operating in a compromised intelligence environment be handled through a separate administrative channel with independent credential verification. A direct institutional response to the specific vulnerability that Sauer had exploited and that Olivia Hayes had operated around for 4 days alone in a fog-covered mountain range because the system had failed her, and she had refused to accept that failure as the end of the matter. The protocol did not bear her name. The people who wrote it knew where it came from. Webb, when he heard about the protocol, said only, good, and then went back to whatever he was doing, which was the appropriate response from a man who understood that the most important changes in any institution were the ones that happened quietly through procedure and documentation, in the unglamorous machinery of how organizations actually functioned, because the unglamorous machinery was where the permanent changes lived, long after the operational moments that produced them had passed into classified records and faded from the memory of everyone except the people who had been there. Jordan Price told the story exactly once to a group of junior operators during a training session on intelligence security protocols, without names and without classified detail, as an illustration of why the systems they were trained to trust required people who understood those systems deeply enough to know when they had failed. He told it the way good teachers tell stories not to impress, but to transfer something real about how the world worked. The junior operators listened. Some of them understood. Those were the ones who mattered. Olivia Hayes returned to operational status after her 48-hour stand-down. She filed her after-action report directly to Hargrove's office as instructed. She participated in every follow-on debrief that the J2 review required of her. She answered every question completely and without embellishment and without the performance of modesty that some people used as a kind of currency in institutional settings. She was simply precise, because precision was the standard she held herself to in every environment, and the institutional environment was no exception. She did not talk about the Corin operation in the mess hall, or in the corridors, or in any of the informal spaces where operational stories circulated among the people who had been present for them. She had not talked about anything operational in those spaces for 4 months before the Corin range, and she did not begin doing so afterward. What she did was work. The same work she had always done in the same way she had always done it, with the patience and the discipline and the relentless commitment to preparation that had made her the kind of operator who could spend 4 days alone in fog-covered mountains without support and without acknowledgement, building the case that nobody else had been able to build through the channels that were supposed to exist for exactly that purpose. Because some problems did not wait for the system to fix itself. Because some evidence did not survive the waiting. Because sometimes the person who understood what needed to be done was also the only person in a position to do it. And the only question that mattered in that moment was whether that person had the preparation and the will to act on that understanding, without the comfort of institutional backing, without the assurance of recognition, without the certainty of anything except the evidence in front of them, and the judgment they had spent years building to interpret it. Olivia Hayes had that preparation. She had been building it for years in the specific and unglamorous way that preparation was actually built, not in the dramatic moments, but in the quiet ones. In the hours of study and practice and patient observation that most people never saw, and that produced no immediate return, and that accumulated over time into the kind of capability that looked like something extraordinary when it was finally needed, but was actually the compound result of thousands of ordinary decisions to be more ready than the situation currently required. She was not a legend. She was not the ghost of any ridge. She was a professional who had done what the situation required of her, with the tools she had at the moment when it mattered, and she had done it well enough that the consequences of her work would shape the institutional landscape of coalition special operations for years after anyone in that landscape would know to connect those consequences to the 4 days she had spent in the Koran Mountains before anyone knew she was there. That was sufficient, more than sufficient. The fog in the Koran range had lifted by the time the SOCOM security team completed their work. The mountain range looked exactly as it had always looked. Remote, cold, indifferent to the events that had played out across its ridges and valleys. The compound was seized and processed. The relay station equipment was cataloged and sent to technical intelligence for analysis. The drone was recovered from where it had eventually exhausted its power supply and set down on the mountain's eastern face, and it too was sent for technical analysis, and the analysis produced another thread in the 22-month record that Sauer had spent considerable effort making difficult to follow. Every thread was followed. Every thread was documented. And when the documentation was complete, and the record had been amended, and the protocols had been rewritten, and the structural changes that Olivia Hayes's 4 days in a mountain range had made possible had been permanently installed in the machinery of how coalition special operations planned and protected their missions. When all of that was done, the thing that remained was not a story about a woman who had appeared from the fog to save a SEAL team. It was the record of what one person prepared and committed, and unwilling to accept that the failure of the system was the end of the matter, could do when the moment finally demanded it. She had been in the mountains before anyone knew to look for her. She had done what needed to be done before anyone gave her permission to do it. And when the fog finally cleared, everything she had carried out of those mountains held. Every word of it held.